The Colt 45 felt heavy in Solomon Reed's weathered hand. His finger rested on the trigger, not quite pressing, but not relaxed either. Across the ornate mahogany desk, Victor Hargrove's eyes widened with recognition, a flicker of disbelief crossing his aristocratic features. "Reed, impossible!" Victor's voice faltered, his composure cracking for perhaps the first time in decades. Solomon's blue eyes faded like an old chambray shirt, but hard as Texas flint never left Victor's face. Wrinkles deepened around them, lines carved by sun, wind, and grief. 10 years I thought you were dead, Victor." Solomon's voice was low, rough as wagon wheels on gravel. "But the devil doesn't die easy, does he?" A bead of sweat traced Victor's temple, disappearing into his silver-streaked beard. Outside the grand windows of the study, the Texas summer sun cast long shadows across manicured lawns, a far cry from the modest ranches that dotted the surrounding countryside. "We were brothers once," Victor said, his eyes darting to the door behind Solomon. "Brothers don't murder each other's families." Solomon's hand didn't shake, not even a tremor, the kind of stillness that comes only to a man who has made peace with what he's about to do. "If you're going to shoot, then shoot," Victor whispered. "Don't waste my time with melodrama." Solomon's thumb pulled back the hammer with a decisive click, and that's when Abigail's voice broke through the silence. "Solomon, don't." 48 hours earlier, Justice Creek ran low in the summer heat. Solomon Reed knelt at its edge, splashing water on his face, letting it drip through his graying beard. At 51, he felt twice his age some mornings. Today was one of those mornings. The creek had earned its name long before Solomon bought this stretch of Texas dirt. Local legend said a cattle rustler had been caught and hanged near its banks back in the 1850s. Justice swift and final. Solomon appreciated the simplicity of the story, even if he no longer believed justice came so easily. He straightened knees, protesting, and looked across his modest ranch. 160 acres of scrubby grassland dotted with mesquite trees, a small herd of cattle, and a 2-room cabin he'd built with his own hands after everything. Not much to show for half a century of living, but it was his. No debts, no partners, no complications, just how he liked it. Sergeant, his aging chestnut gelding, nickered softly from the corral. The horse was approaching 20 now, well past his prime, just like his owner. They'd grown old together, 2 veterans putting one foot in front of the other, day after day. "Coming, old friend?" Solomon called his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke these days, except to Sergeant. The townspeople of San Angelo had long since stopped expecting conversation from the solitary rancher who came to town only when necessary for supplies. Some called him a hermit. Others whispered about his past, fragments of stories about a wife and daughter, about war service. Solomon let them talk. Silence was easier than corrections. In his pocket, his fingers brushed against the gold pocket watch. A habit. A ritual. A penance. The watch hadn't ticked in 10 years. Solomon hadn't wound it since the day they died. Inside the small barn, he gathered his tools. Fence needed mending on the north pasture. Always something broken to fix on a ranch. The rhythms of repair and maintenance structured his days, kept his hands busy, his mind occupied. It was enough. It had to be. The June heat pressed down like a wool blanket as Solomon rode toward the broken fence line. Sweat soaked through his faded blue shirt before he'd gone half a mile. The drought had stretched into its 3rd month, baking the earth into iron-hard clay. Cattle were getting restless, pushing at fences, searching for better grazing. Not that there was any to be found for 50 miles in any direction. Solomon had just dismounted when Sergeant's ears pricked forward. The horse snorted eyes fixed on something in the distance. "What is it, boy?" Solomon murmured, hand instinctively moving to the Winchester rifle in his saddle scabbard. 10 years of solitude had honed his senses. He scanned the horizon, noting a plume of dust rising from the direction of the old Henderson place, abandoned for years now, its buildings slowly returning to the earth. Curiosity and caution battled briefly. He could ignore it. Should ignore it. Curiosity rarely led to anything good in his experience. But Sargent was already moving as though the old horse had made the decision for both of them. "Damn stubborn mule," Solomon muttered, but he swung back into the saddle and turned toward the Henderson property. The dust was settling by the time they approached the sagging remains of the old stable. No horses in sight. No wagon. Solomon frowned, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the weathered building. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in the air, in the unnatural stillness. Even the cicadas had fallen silent. He dismounted again, tying Sargent to a gnarled mesquite tree, and drew his Colt from its holster. The weight of the gun was familiar in his hand, though he hadn't fired it at a man in over a decade. The stable door hung at an angle, its top hinge broken. Solomon approached cautiously, ears straining for any sound. The creak of his boots on the sun-baked earth seemed thunderous in the silence. When he reached the doorway, the stench hit him first. Sweat. Blood. Fear. The smells of human suffering. Then he saw her, a young woman tied to one of the stable's support posts. Her wrists were bound so tightly that blood had dried in dark rivulets down her arms. One eye was swollen shut, her cheek marked with an angry red handprint. Her white dress was torn at the shoulder and hip, stained with dirt and blood. Dark hair fell in tangled waves around a face that, despite its injuries, held a striking beauty. For a heartbeat, Solomon froze. Not from fear, but from the crushing weight of memory. Emma had worn a white dress the day he'd left for war. The day he'd promised to come back to her and Lily. The promise he'd kept, only to lose them anyway. The woman's good eye fluttered open, green as spring grass. She looked at Solomon without hope, without expectation. The look of someone who had given up on salvation. "Please," she whispered the word barely audible. "Just kill me quick." The request jolted Solomon from his paralysis. He holstered his gun and moved toward her, pulling his hunting knife from his belt. "Not going to hurt you, miss," he said quietly. "Going to cut you loose." A flicker of something not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin, crossed her face. Solomon knelt beside her, the knife making quick work of the ropes that bound her wrists to the post. As the last fibers gave way, she slumped forward, too weak to hold herself upright. Solomon caught her before she hit the dirt floor. She was light in his arms, too light, like a bird with hollow bones. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought. Early 20s, perhaps. Just a girl, really. "You've got a name?" he asked, his voice gruff with disuse and emotion he couldn't name. Her cracked lips parted. "Abigail," she whispered. Then, as though the effort of speaking her own name had drained the last of her strength, her eye closed, and she went limp in his arms. Solomon looked down at the unconscious girl, then at the empty doorway leading back to his quiet, uncomplicated life. He knew he should take her to town, leave her with the doctor or the sheriff. Let someone else handle this trouble. But as he lifted her one fragile arm dangling like a broken branch, she stirred just enough to whisper something that froze his blood. "You don't know what you've just done." The girl Abigail didn't wake during the ride back to Solomon's cabin. He'd wrapped her in his spare blanket, cradling her against his chest, as Sargent picked his careful way across Voorhees, the sun-baked terrain. The old horse seemed to understand the preciousness of their cargo, avoiding the rougher patches, maintaining a smooth gait that wouldn't jostle his injured passenger. Solomon's mind raced with questions. Who had done this to her? Why, how long had she been tied in that abandoned stable? And most pressingly, what had she meant by those whispered words? The sun was dipping toward the horizon by the time they reached the cabin. Golden light spilled across the weathered porch, giving the humble structure a warmth it rarely possessed. Solomon dismounted carefully, keeping Abigail secure in his arms, and carried her inside. The cabin's interior was spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall opposite a narrow bed with a quilt Emma had stitched in another lifetime. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood near the small window. Few personal touches softened the space, no photographs, no mementos, just the tools of survival. A rifle mounted on the wall, cooking implements hanging near the hearth, a shelf of basic supplies. Solomon laid Abigail gently on the bed. In the cabin's shadowed light, her injuries looked even worse. The bruising around her eye had deepened to purple, and the rope burns on her wrists were angry red against her pale skin. He fetched water from the pump outside, filling his best enamel basin. Then he gathered clean cloths, the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes, and the small tin of salve he'd traded for last winter when Sargent had gotten a nasty cut on his flank. As he set to cleaning her wounds, Solomon realized how long it had been since he'd touched another human being. Years, perhaps. The sensation was strange. The warmth of her skin, the fragile pulse at her wrist, the way her breath hitched when he dabbed whiskey on a particularly deep abrasion. "Sorry," he muttered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. When he'd cleaned the dirt and blood from her face and arms, he hesitated, looking at her torn dress. Propriety warred with necessity. The dress was filthy, possibly hiding other injuries, but she was unconscious, vulnerable. Solomon settled for covering her with the quilt and placing a cup of water on the small table beside the bed. He'd built a fire to ward off the evening chill, and now he sat in one of the wooden chairs watching the stranger who had upended his solitude. Night fell. Solomon dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every small sound, the pop of the fire, the distant howl of a coyote, the creak of the cabin settling. Each time his eyes went first to the bed, confirming that Abigail still breathed, still lay in uneasy repose. It was past midnight when she finally stirred. A small moan escaped her lips as she shifted beneath the quilt. Solomon straightened in his chair, unsure whether to approach or give her space. Her good eye opened confusion, giving way to alarm, as she realized she was in an unfamiliar place. She tried to sit up, wincing with pain. "Easy," Solomon said quietly. "You're safe." Abigail's gaze found him in the firelight wariness evident in the way she pulled the quilt tighter around herself. "Where am I?" Her voice was stronger than it had been in the stable, but still rough from thirst. "My cabin, near Justice Creek, about 10 miles southwest of San Angelo." Solomon gestured to the cup on the table. "There's water if you want it." She reached for it with a trembling hand, and Solomon noticed her assessing her surroundings, marking the door and window escape routes. The instinct of prey that has escaped one predator only to fear falling into the clutches of another. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, recognizing her fear. "Name's Solomon Reed. Found you at the old Henderson place. Brought you here to tend your wounds." Abigail sipped the water, watching him over the rim of the cup. The wariness in her gaze didn't diminish. "Thank you," she said, finally setting the cup down, "for cutting me free." Solomon nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Who did that to you?" A shadow crossed her face. "Men who work for Victor Hargrove." The name hit Solomon like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. couldn't think past the roaring in his ears. Victor Hargrove, a ghost, a dead man. Victor Hargrove is dead, he said, his voice flat. Died at Yellow Creek. Last battle of the war. Abigail's gaze sharpened. You know him? It wasn't a question. Solomon's hand went to his pocket fingers, closing around the cold metal of the watch. Knew him. A lifetime ago. He's very much alive, Mr. Reed. And very dangerous. Abigail shifted again, grimacing. He wants my father's land in Wichita County. When my father refused to sell, Hargrove's men took me. Leverage, they called it. The pieces began to fall into place. Your father, he has a name, Samuel Hayes. He owns the Crescent Moon Ranch. She lifted her chin slightly, a gesture of pride despite her condition. It's been in our family for 3 generations. Solomon absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the Victor Hargrove he'd known, his commanding officer, a decorated war hero, with the man who would order a young woman kidnapped and beaten. Why does he want your father's land so badly? It's not just ours. He's buying up ranches all through North Texas. Abigail's gaze dropped to her hands, still raw from the ropes. Or taking them when buying doesn't work. Solomon stood abruptly, moving to the fireplace. He added another log, watching the flames leap higher. His mind was a tangle of memories and questions. Victor Hargrove, alive, here in Texas. It seemed impossible. You know him well, don't you? Abigail asked, her voice gentle but probing. Solomon turned back to her, his expression guarded. I served under him during the war. The war between the states. Union Army, 9th Illinois Infantry. Solomon rarely spoke of his service, but the circumstances demanded truth. I was his captain. He was my colonel. Abigail's expression changed, a new understanding dawning. You're from the North. Originally, Solomon's tone made it clear he had no interest in discussing his origins further. Rest now. We'll figure out what to do in the morning. He turned to leave, intending to sleep in the barn and give her privacy, but her voice stopped him at the door. Mr. Reed, those men who took me, they'll be looking. Solomon nodded grimly. I know. I'm just bait, she whispered, echoing her earlier words. Hargrove doesn't want me. He wants my father to surrender the land. And now, she looked around the cabin, understanding the jeopardy she'd brought to his door. I've put you in danger too. Solomon's hand rested on the door frame. Been in danger before, he said quietly. Get some sleep, Miss Hayes. Outside, the night air cooled his face as he crossed to the barn. Sergeant nickered softly in greeting, and Solomon paused to stroke the horse's velvet nose. Got ourselves in a mess, old friend, he murmured. In the distance, an owl called its hollow question, echoing across the moonlit pasture. Solomon stood listening, feeling the weight of the past pressing down upon him. 10 years of carefully constructed solitude threatened by a single name, Victor Hargrove. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the pocket watch. In the silver moonlight, he could just make out the inscription on its cover, To Solomon, all my love, Emma. The watch had been a gift before he left for war, Emma's way of reminding him that time would bring them back together. He'd carried it through every battle, every march, every cold night in a muddy tent. It had stopped the day Emma and Lily died, and Solomon had never wound it again. What was the point of marking time when everything that mattered was gone? But now, standing in the quiet Texas night, with danger on the horizon, Solomon felt something stir within him. Not hope, he was too far gone for that. But purpose, perhaps. A reason to face the coming day beyond mere survival. Victor Hargrove was alive. The man who had once saved Solomon's life on a bloody battlefield. the man who had ordered the massacre of civilians at Maple Creek. The man who Solomon now suspected with growing certainty was somehow connected to the flood that had taken Emma and Lily. Too many coincidences. Too many ghosts converging at once. Solomon returned the watch to his pocket and entered the barn. He checked his Winchester cleaning and oiling it with practiced hands. Then he settled on a pile of hay, his rifle within reach, and prepared for a night of watchful waiting. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of rain-swollen rivers and Emma's face disappearing beneath churning water, of Lily's small hand slipping from his grasp, and beneath it all, Victor Hargrove's voice, giving orders that couldn't be disobeyed. Dawn broke gray and heavy, with the promise of rare summer rain. Solomon rose before first light, his body stiff from the night in the barn, but his mind clear. The dreams had brought clarity, if not peace. He tended to Sergeant and the cattle, moving through the familiar chores with mechanical efficiency, while his thoughts circled the problem of Abigail Hayes and Victor Hargrove. By the time he approached the cabin carrying fresh eggs and a pail of milk, he'd settled on a course of action. He would take the girl to San Angelo to Sheriff Morgan. Let the law handle this matter. The smell of coffee greeted him as he pushed open the cabin door. Abigail stood at the small stove, her back to him. She'd found one of his old shirts, the blue one Emma had mended countless times, and wore it over her torn dress like a makeshift jacket. She turned at his entrance, and Solomon was struck by how different she looked in the morning light. Still bruised and battered, but standing straight, her good eye clear and alert. "Hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the coffee pot. "Thought it was the least I could do." Solomon set down his burdens on the table. "You should be resting." "I've rested enough." She poured coffee into 2 tin cups, moving with careful precision to compensate for her injuries. "We need to talk about what happens next." And Solomon accepted the cup she offered, noting the way her hands trembled slightly despite her composed demeanor. Up close, he could see she was even younger than he'd first thought. 23 at most. But there was an old soul looking out from that bruised face, someone who had seen more of life's hardships than her years suggested. "I'm taking you to town," he said, sipping the coffee. It was good, stronger than he usually made it. "Sheriff Morgan's a fair man. He'll help get you back to your father." Abigail shook her head, wincing as the movement aggravated her injuries. "Hargrove has men everywhere, even in San Angelo, most likely. The sheriff might be fair, but is he strong enough to stand against Hargrove's money and influence?" Solomon frowned. She had a point. In his self-imposed isolation, he'd paid little attention to local politics and power struggles. If Victor had been systematically buying up land and loyalty, the sheriff might indeed be compromised. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked. Abigail set her cup down and reached into the pocket of her torn dress. She withdrew a small packet of herbs wrapped in cloth. "First, I'd like to properly tend to these wounds. I know some things about healing." She unwrapped the herbs, revealing a mixture of dried leaves and roots. "My mother taught me, before she died." Solomon watched as she crushed some of the herbs between her fingers, releasing a sharp, clean scent that reminded him of pine forests and mountain streams. She added them to a small pot of water heating on the stove. "Your mother was a healer?" he asked, curious despite himself. A small smile touched Abigail's lips, transforming her face despite the bruising. "She was Cherokee, knew the old ways. My father met her when he was surveying land near the nation boundaries." The smile faded. "She passed when I was 15. Fever took her." Solomon nodded, understanding loss too well to offer empty condolences. Instead, he moved to the stove and prepared a simple breakfast while Abigail continued with her herbal concoction. They worked in companionable silence, moving around each other in the small space with surprising ease. As they ate, Abigail applied the herbal poultice to her wrists, the worst of her visible injuries. The mixture smelled medicinal, but not unpleasant. "My suggestion," she said, returning to their earlier conversation, "is that I stay hidden here for a day or two, just until the worst of these marks fade. Then we can think about getting word to my father that I'm safe." Solomon considered her proposal. It meant delaying his return to solitude, extending his involvement in her troubles. But the alternative, delivering her straight into potential danger, sat poorly with him. "One day," he conceded, "then we reassess." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you." They finished the meal in silence. Afterward, Solomon showed her where to find clean linens and offered her the privacy of the cabin to wash properly. He retreated to the porch, settling into the old rocking chair that had been Emma's favorite spot to watch the sunset. The coming rain darkened the horizon, promising relief from the drought, but also limiting visibility. Solomon scanned the approaches to the cabin, alert for any sign of movement. If Hargrove's men were searching for Abigail, they'd eventually make their way here. The isolation that had been his refuge might now prove a liability. No neighbors to raise an alarm, no passing traffic to witness trouble. Inside, he could hear water splashing as Abigail bathed. The domestic sounds stirred memories he'd thought long buried. Emma singing softly as she washed dishes. Lily's laughter as she played with the rag doll Solomon had brought back from a trip to St. Louis. He pulled the watch from his pocket, running his thumb over its engraved cover. For a decade he'd existed rather than lived, going through the motions of survival without purpose beyond the next sunrise. Now danger and duty had found him again, bringing with them the uncomfortable realization that perhaps he wasn't as dead inside as he'd believed. The cabin door opened and Abigail stepped onto the porch. She'd changed back into her white dress, which she'd apparently washed and mended as best she could. Her dark hair, still damp, was neatly braided over one shoulder. The bruising on her face was still vivid, but the herbal poultice had reduced the swelling around her eye enough that she could open it partially. "Better?" she asked, gesturing to her appearance. Solomon nodded, returning the watch to his pocket. "Much." Abigail lowered herself carefully into the second rocking chair. Her movements were measured, betraying the pain she still felt, but was too proud to mention. "That watch," she said after a moment. "It looks special." Solomon stiffened, unaccustomed to personal questions, but something about the girl's direct gaze made evasion seem churlish. "From my wife, before the war. She's gone. 10 years now." Solomon's voice was flat. "Her and our daughter Lily. Flash flood took them. Creek rose 20 feet in less than an hour after the dam upstream broke." Abigail's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm so sorry." Solomon looked out at the gathering clouds. "Watch stopped that day. Never wounded again." He hadn't meant to share that detail, but the words escaped before he could reconsider. "Time stopped for me, too, I suppose." The moment stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss. Then Abigail spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "My mother used to say that grief is like a river. It carves its own path through our lives. We can't stop it, but we can learn to build bridges across it." Solomon glanced at her, struck by the wisdom in one so young. "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was." Abigail smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes despite the pain it must have caused. "She also would have scolded me for getting caught by Hargrove's men. She always said I was too headstrong for my own good." The mention of Hargrove brought them back to their present predicament. Solomon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Tell me everything you know about what Hargrove is doing. Why he wants your father's land. Why he's back in Texas. Abigail's expression grew serious. He showed up in Wichita County about 6 months ago. Started buying land first near the river, then expanding outward. Some people sold willingly, he offered good prices, others had accidents. Her voice hardened on the last word. Barn fires, cattle getting sick, the usual tactics. And your father wouldn't sell. The crescent moon has been in our family since before the Republic. My grandfather's blood is in that soil. Abigail's chin lifted in that proud gesture Solomon was beginning to recognize. My father told Hargrove he'd die before selling. So Hargrove decided to give him motivation. Abigail nodded grimly. I was in town picking up supplies. 3 men grabbed me right off the street in broad daylight. No one moved to help, they were too scared. Hargrove's reputation had preceded him. Solomon considered this information. It aligned with the Victor Hargrove he remembered, strategic, ruthless, when necessary, but always with a larger objective in mind. What's on your father's land that makes it so valuable? He asked. Oil. Not that we know of. It's good grazing land, better water access than most, but nothing extraordinary. Abigail frowned. That's what makes it so strange. He could have bought 10 other ranches for less trouble. Solomon was about to press further when Sergeant's warning whinny cut through the air. Both of them tensed, heads turning toward the sound. A rider was approaching from the east, moving at a steady trot along the faint trail that led to the cabin. Even at a distance, Solomon could tell the horse was high quality, a sleek black stallion that likely cost more than his entire herd of cattle. Inside, Solomon ordered, standing and reaching for the rifle he'd propped against the cabin wall. Stay away from the windows. Abigail obeyed without question, slipping into the cabin. Solomon remained on the porch, rifle held casually but ready, watching the approaching rider. As the man drew nearer, details became clearer. Expensive clothes, a black vest over a white shirt, despite the heat. A silver watch chain gleaming against the vest. A revolver holstered at his hip. His face was handsome in a hard way, with a strong jaw and calculating eyes beneath the brim of a black hat. He reined in about 20 yards from the cabin, assessing Solomon with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to measuring threats. Afternoon. The rider called, his voice carrying a trace of southern gentility that didn't match his predatory gaze. Hope I'm not intruding. You're on my land, Solomon replied evenly. That's the definition of intrusion. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Fair enough. Name's Jasper Dalton. I represent Mr. Victor Hargrove. Solomon's grip tightened on the rifle, but his expression remained impassive. Don't know any Hargrove. Dalton's smile widened, revealing teeth too perfect for a genuine frontiersman. Now that's interesting, because Mr. Hargrove certainly knows you, Captain Reed. The use of his former rank confirmed what Solomon had already suspected. This was no random search. They'd tracked Abigail here specifically because they knew who Solomon was and his connection to Victor. Been a long time since anyone called me Captain, Solomon said, keeping his voice neutral. What does your employer want with me after all these years? Dalton shifted in his saddle. His posture relaxed, but his eyes constantly moving, cataloging details. Mr. Hargrove merely sent me to retrieve something that belongs to him. A girl. Abigail Hayes. Dark hair, green eyes, about 23. Seen anyone fitting that description? Can't say that I have. Solomon met Dalton's gaze steadily. Not much traffic through here. I prefer it that way. I understand completely. Dalton gestured to the vast emptiness surrounding the cabin. A man seeks solitude for many reasons. To escape memories. To hide from consequences. His gaze sharpened. To bury the past. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Solomon remained still, calculating distances and angles, assessing how quickly he could raise the rifle if needed. "The war's been over for a long time," Solomon said finally. "Whatever Hargrove and I might have been to each other then, we're nothing to each other now." Dalton nodded as though Solomon had confirmed something important. "Mr. Hargrove anticipated you might feel that way. He asked me to remind you of Maple Creek." The name hit Solomon like a physical blow. Maple Creek, the village, the orders, the screams, the memory he'd tried hardest to bury. "You were there," Solomon asked, his voice hoarse. "I was a lieutenant, in your company." Dalton touched the brim of his hat in a mock salute. "You probably don't remember me. I was one of the younger officers. But I remember you, Captain Reed, the hero who saved Colonel Hargrove's life at Antietam, the loyal soldier who followed orders at Maple Creek." Solomon's mind raced. If Dalton had been at Maple Creek, then he knew. He knew what they'd done, what Victor had ordered them to do, what Solomon had failed to prevent. "What does Hargrove want?" Solomon asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. Dalton's smile faded, replaced by the cold efficiency of a man delivering an ultimatum. "He wants the girl, and he wants your silence. In exchange, he's prepared to be generous. Your past stays buried. Your future becomes comfortable. And if I haven't seen any girl, then I'd advise you to keep it that way." Dalton gathered his reins. "Mr. Hargrove remembers his friends, Captain. He also remembers those who cross him." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, maintaining the same unhurried pace. Solomon watched until he disappeared over the ridge, then lowered his rifle, realizing his knuckles had gone white around the stock. The cabin door creaked open behind him. Abigail stood in the doorway, her face pale beneath the bruises. "He was there," she said quietly, "at Maple Creek, whatever that was." Solomon didn't answer immediately. The past he'd so carefully walled off was crumbling around him, and he had no words to explain the horror of that day, the weight of complicity he'd carried for decades. "It was a mistake," he said finally, his voice hollow. "A terrible mistake." Abigail stepped closer, her green eyes searching his face. "What happened at Maple Creek, Solomon?" The sound of his given name, spoken gently but insistently, broke something loose inside him. Solomon sank onto the porch step, suddenly exhausted, the rifle laying forgotten across his knees. "It was 1864, near the end of the war. We were deep in Confederate territory, tired, paranoid. There had been guerrilla attacks on our supply lines for weeks." The words came slowly at first, then faster, as though a dam had broken. "We came to this small village, Maple Creek. Mostly women, children, old men. The fighting men were all gone to the war." Abigail sat beside him, her presence steady, listening without judgment. "There was intelligence that the village was harboring rebels, storing weapons. Victor Colonel Hargrove ordered a search." Solomon's gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "A woman approached me, begged me to stop the men from ransacking their homes. She had a shawl, blue with white flowers. I told her to speak to the colonel." The memory was vivid now, unstoppable. "One of our nervous young privates thought he saw a weapon, fired a shot. Then everything went to hell. The men were tired, scared, angry, started shooting at anything that moved." Solomon closed his eyes, but it didn't stop the images. Victor didn't order them to stop. He ordered them to burn the village. said we needed to make an example. And you, Abigail's voice was soft. I froze. The admission tore from Solomon's throat. I should have countermanded the order. Should have stopped it. But I froze. By the time I found my voice, it was too late. 27 civilians dead. An entire village erased. Silence fell between them, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. The storm was moving closer. The woman with the shawl, Abigail asked finally. Solomon shook his head. Never saw her again. Presumed dead with the others. Abigail placed her hand on his arm, the gesture surprisingly comforting. You've carried this a long time. Not long enough. Solomon opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. Now Victor's back, and somehow he's connected to you and your father. And to the flood that took your family, Abigail suggested gently. Solomon hadn't voiced that suspicion aloud, but hearing it from her made it suddenly terribly plausible. The timing fits. The dam that broke was on land owned by a shell company. I never pursued. It was too broken by grief. We need to know more, Abigail said, her voice taking on a determined edge. About why Hargrove wants our land so badly. About what really happened to your family. Solomon stood, picking up his rifle. The conversation had shifted something fundamental between them. They were no longer simply rescuer and rescued, but allies against a common enemy. Dalton will be back, he said grimly. And he won't be alone next time. Abigail rose beside him, wincing slightly but standing straight. Then we'd better be ready. As if punctuating her words, the first fat raindrops began to fall, pattering on the cabin's tin roof. The drought was breaking, and with it, Solomon's long isolation. Inside the cabin, they began to prepare. Solomon cleaned his weapons, the Winchester, his Colt, and old shotgun that had belonged to Emma's father. Abigail tore strips of clean cloth for bandages and prepared more of her herbal remedies. Night fell early, hastened by the storm clouds. The rain came down in earnest, now drumming on the roof, transforming the parched earth outside into mud. Solomon lit the oil lamps and built up the fire against the unusual chill. We should take shifts sleeping, he said, checking the load in his revolver one last time. They won't come in this rain, but by morning. Abigail nodded, her face solemn in the lamplight. I can take first watch. I'm not sure I could sleep anyway. Solomon was about to argue when a sharp crack split the air. Not thunder, but the unmistakable report of a rifle. Simultaneously, the window beside Abigail shattered, sending glass flying. Solomon lunged, tackling her to the floor, as a second shot punched through the cabin wall. They lay there for a heartbeat, his body shielding hers, both breathing hard from shock and adrenaline. Are you hit? He demanded, already running his hands over her shoulders, checking for blood. No, she gasped. I'm fine. Solomon rolled off her, staying low. Stay down, crawl to the back wall. Its stone bullets won't penetrate. Abigail obeyed, moving with surprising agility despite her injuries. Solomon crept to the broken window, keeping below the sill. The rain obscured visibility, but muzzle flashes gave away positions. At least 2 shooters, maybe 3, using the trees at the edge of the property for cover. So much for Dalton's promise to report back to Hargrove. Either he'd been lying, or Hargrove had already given the order to retrieve Abigail by any means necessary. Solomon raised himself just enough to fire a warning shot toward the trees, then ducked back down as return fire splintered the window frame. He worked his way to the door, staying low. What are you doing? Abigail called from the relative safety of the back wall. Creating a diversion, Solomon replied. When I give the word, douse the lamps." He reached the door, took a deep breath, then flung it open and fired 2 quick shots into the night. Immediately, gunfire erupted from the trees, bullets thudding into the doorframe and cabin walls. "Now!" Solomon shouted. Abigail extinguished the lamps, plunging the cabin into darkness, relieved only by the flickering firelight. Solomon rolled across the open doorway, making his way to the far window, the one facing the barn. He'd left it unlatched for just this purpose. "Stay here," he told Abigail. "I'm going to circle behind them." "Solomon, no!" Her voice was tight with fear. "There are too many." "I've got the advantage," he insisted. "They don't know the land. I do." Before she could protest further, he slipped through the window, dropping into the mud below. The rain hammered down, soaking him instantly, but also concealing his movements. He kept low, using the darkness and his knowledge of the terrain to circle wide around the cabin. The attackers were still focusing their fire on the door, and windows apparently unaware that he'd slipped out. Solomon counted 3 distinct muzzle flashes. 3 men. Not impossible odds. He moved closer, using a lightning flash to pinpoint their positions. They were clustered near the largest oak, about 50 yards from the cabin. Poor tactical choice, too close together, no clear escape route. Solomon raised his rifle sighting on the nearest figure. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then hesitated. These weren't soldiers in a war. They were hired guns, yes, but killing them would only escalate the situation. If he could capture one question him, Solomon adjusted his aim and fired at the ground near the men's feet. The shot had the desired effect. They scattered in surprise, one diving to the left, one to the right, and the third falling back toward the creek. Solomon pursued the one heading for the creek, the man least likely to encounter Abigail if things went wrong. 3 long strides brought him within range, and he swung the rifle like a club, connecting with the back of the man's head. The attacker went down hard, face first, into the mud. Solomon was on him instantly, pressing a knee into his back, using his belt to bind the man's hands. The entire confrontation had taken less than a minute. Gunfire still sounded from the direction of the cabin. Solomon dragged his semi-conscious prisoner behind a large rock for temporary shelter, then sprinted back toward the continuing battle, fear for Abigail driving him faster than his aging legs wanted to move. As he approached, he saw one of the attackers attempting to kick in the cabin door. The other was nowhere in sight, possibly circling around to the back or windows. Solomon raised his rifle and fired a warning shot over the door-kicker's head. "Next one goes between your shoulders," he called, his voice carrying despite the rain. "Drop your weapon." The man froze, then slowly lowered his pistol to the ground. "Hands up. Turn around. Slow." The attacker complied, revealing a young face, hardly more than a boy, really. Early 20s at most, with a thin mustache and wide, frightened eyes. "Your friend, by the creek, is already down," Solomon said, keeping his rifle trained on the young man's chest. "The third one would be wise to show himself before things get worse." As if in answer, a shot rang out from behind the cabin. Solomon's heart lurched. Abigail was in there, possibly in the line of fire. He had to end this quickly. "Last chance," he called to the remaining hidden attacker. "Show yourself or your friends start losing parts they're fond of." Silence stretched for several seconds. Then slowly a figure emerged from behind the cabin, hands raised. This one was older, weathered, with the hard eyes of a man who'd seen his share of violence. "Smart choice," Solomon said. "Both of you over there by the porch, face down in the mud. Hands behind your backs." As they complied, the cabin door creaked open. Abigail stood in the doorway, Solomon's shotgun clutched in her hands. Her face was pale, but determined. "Are you all right?" Solomon asked, not taking his eyes off the subdued attackers. Better than them, she replied, a hint of grim satisfaction in her voice. This one tried to come through the back window. She nodded toward the older man. He's bleeding. I winged him with the shotgun. Solomon's estimation of Abigail rose several notches. She was not only a survivor, but a fighter, a quality he respected more than almost any other. Using strips torn from the attacker's own shirts, Solomon bound their hands securely. Then he left them under Abigail's watchful eye while he retrieved the third man from the creek. By the time all three were secured on the cabin porch, the rain had slackened to a steady drizzle. Dawn was still hours away, but the immediate danger had passed. Solomon built up the fire while Abigail tended to the older man's shotgun wound, a minor injury to his upper arm. "You're lucky," she told him as she wrapped a bandage around the cleaned wound. "An inch to the left, and you'd be missing an arm." The man glared at her, but remained silent. In fact, none of the captives had spoken a word since their capture, which struck Solomon as odd. Most hired guns would be bargaining by now, offering information in exchange for leniency. "Who are you working for?" Solomon asked the eldest of the three, figuring him for the leader. No response. "Hargrove sent you," Solomon continued, "but Dalton said he'd report back first." So either Dalton lied or Hargrove already had orders in place to retrieve Abigail, regardless of what Dalton found here. Still nothing, not even a flicker of recognition at the names. Solomon changed tactics. "You're not local. None of you are. Your clothes, your weapons, all too expensive for regular ranch hands. You're professional gunmen brought in specifically for this job." The youngest one shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Abigail finished bandaging the wounded man and moved to stand beside Solomon. "They won't talk," she said quietly. "Hargrove pays for loyalty." "Every man has his price," Solomon replied loud enough for the captives to hear. "And his breaking point." He reached into the wounded man's vest pocket and withdrew a folded paper. Opening it revealed a bank draft for a substantial sum signed by Victor Hargrove. "Interesting," Solomon murmured. "This is dated yesterday. Hargrove knew exactly where to find you, Miss Hayes, which means he knew where I was being held all along." Abigail finished, her expression hardening. "The kidnapping, the beating, it was all for show. To frighten my father into compliance." Solomon nodded grimly. It fit with what he remembered of Victor's tactics. Create fear, then offer salvation at a price. He continued searching the men, finding nothing more of interest, until he reached into the youngest one's shirt pocket. There he discovered a worn photograph. Solomon stared at it momentarily, forgetting to breathe. The photograph showed three men in Union Army uniforms standing stiffly before a photographer's backdrop. On the left, a younger version of Solomon himself, captain's bars gleaming on his shoulders. In the center, Victor Hargrove, tall and commanding in a colonel's uniform. And on the right, a fresh-faced lieutenant who could only be Jasper Dalton. Solomon turned the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, Colonel V.H., Captain S.R., and Lieutenant J.D. Antietam, 1862. "You know these men," Abigail said, looking over his shoulder at the photograph. "I was these men," Solomon replied quietly. "Or at least, I was one of them." He showed the photograph to the captives. "Where did you get this?" The youngest one finally broke his silence. "Dalton gave it to us. Said to show it to you if things got difficult. Said you'd understand what it meant." "And what does it mean?" Abigail asked. Solomon's jaw tightened. "It means Victor is calling in old debts, reminding me of oaths sworn, bonds forged in blood." He pocketed the photograph and regarded their prisoners thoughtfully. The storm had passed, leaving a damp, chilly night in its wake. The three men sat shivering on the porch, bound and defeated. "We're taking them to town at first light," Solomon decided. "Sheriff Morgan needs to see what Hargrove's up to. These men, the bank draft the photograph, it's all evidence." Abigail nodded, but her expression was troubled. "And if the sheriff is already in Hargrove's pocket, then we'll know we're truly on our own." Solomon glanced at the lightening eastern sky. Dawn wasn't far off. "Get some rest. I'll watch them." As Abigail retreated into the cabin, Solomon settled into the rocking chair rifle across his knees. The wounded man regarded him through narrowed eyes. "You're making a mistake, Reed," he said, finally breaking his silence. "Hargrove never forgets a betrayal." "Neither do I," Solomon replied evenly. "And he betrayed me first." The man laughed a harsh sound with no humor in it. "You have no idea what you're up against. Hargrove owns half the county already. By year's end, he'll own it all." "Why," Solomon leaned forward, "what's so special about this land that he's willing to kidnap and threaten for it?" The man's gaze shifted away. "Just following orders." Solomon recognized the evasion he'd used it himself after Maple Creek. Just following orders. The refuge of men who chose not to question the morality of their actions. "There's something on Hayes' land," Solomon pressed. "Something valuable enough to risk exposure and legal trouble. What is it?" No answer. Solomon sat back, considering. Victor had always been ambitious, but also calculating. He wouldn't go to these lengths without substantial potential reward. The pocket watch seemed suddenly heavy in Solomon's pocket. He withdrew it, turning it over in his hands, watching the first pale light of dawn gleam on its golden surface. Time was moving again. Events set in motion decades ago were accelerating toward some unknown conclusion, and Solomon, who had spent 10 years trying to stand still, found himself caught in the current once more. Whatever Victor was searching for, whatever had brought him back into Solomon's life after all these years, one thing was becoming increasingly clear: the past could not remain buried forever. Justice, like the creek that gave his land its name, would find its path eventually. And Solomon Reed, who had once failed to stand against the tide of violence at Maple Creek, would not make the same mistake twice. The journey to San Angelo took longer than it should have. Solomon had hitched the prisoners to his old wagon, their hands bound, but feet free enough to walk alongside. The overnight rain had turned the dirt roads to mud, forcing them to move at a crawl to keep the wagon wheels from bogging down. Abigail sat on the wagon seat beside Solomon, her posture straight despite her injuries. The bruises on her face had begun to fade from angry purple to yellowish green, a testament to both time and her herbal remedies. She'd fashioned a makeshift bonnet from an old piece of cloth to shield her face from curious eyes once they reached town. "You're sure about this?" she asked quietly, as the first buildings of San Angelo appeared on the horizon. "Once we involve the law, there's no going back." Solomon kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the reins. "We passed the point of no return when Dalton showed up at my door." The truth hung between them unspoken, but understood by saving Abigail. Solomon had declared his position in a war he'd spent a decade avoiding. Now all that remained was to see it through. Sheriff Walter Morgan's office sat on the main street of San Angelo, a sturdy brick building with barred windows and a sign proclaiming "Law and Order" in faded paint. As Solomon drew the wagon to a halt before it, townsfolk stopped to stare. It had been months since most had seen the reclusive rancher, and years since he'd brought trouble to their doorstep. The sheriff emerged before Solomon could even step down, alerted by the commotion outside. Morgan was a tall man in his 60s, silver-haired and straight-backed, with a face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. His star gleamed on his chest, polished to a shine that spoke of pride in his position. "Reed," he said by way of greeting his weathered face, giving nothing away. "Been a while." Solomon nodded. "Sheriff, Got something that requires your attention." Morgan's gaze swept over the wagon, taking in the bound men and Abigail's partially concealed face. His expression remained neutral, but Solomon caught the slight narrowing of his eyes, the look of a man assessing potential complications to his otherwise quiet day. "Better come inside," Morgan said, finally turning to his deputy, who had appeared in the doorway. "Jenkins, help get these men secured." The deputy, a gangly young man with an earnest face, hurried to comply. As he approached the wagon, the older prisoner spat at his feet. "Careful, boy," the man growled. "You're interfering with private business." Morgan's hand moved to rest on the butt of his revolver. "The only business being conducted right now is mine. Inside. All of you." The interior of the sheriff's office was cool and dim after the morning sunlight. A row of 3 cells occupied the back wall, currently empty. A scarred wooden desk dominated the center of the room, papers stacked neatly at one corner beside a pot of cold coffee. The prisoners were secured in the cells, the wounded man's bandages checked and deemed adequate. Only then did Morgan settle behind his desk, gesturing for Solomon and Abigail to take the chairs opposite. "Now," he said, folding his hands on the desktop, "suppose you tell me what brings you to town with 3 trussed-up men and a lady who's clearly seen better days." Solomon laid out the situation in precise economical language, finding Abigail learning of her connection to Hargrove, the attack on his ranch. He produced the bank draft and the photograph as evidence, placing them on the desk between them. Morgan examined both items carefully, his expression giving nothing away. When Solomon mentioned Maple Creek, however, a flicker of recognition crossed the sheriff's face. "Maple Creek," Morgan repeated, looking up from the photograph. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in many years." Solomon tensed. "You know of it." Morgan leaned back in his chair, studying Solomon with new interest. "I was a lieutenant in the 7th Ohio. Different theater than you boys in the 9th Illinois, but we all heard the stories." His gaze shifted to the photograph. Colonel Hargrove's methods were notorious even then. Relief and wariness mingled in Solomon's chest. If Morgan knew about Maple Creek, about Victor's reputation, he might be more inclined to believe their story. But it also raised a critical question. If Hargrove's been operating in the region for months, buying up land, employing men like these, Solomon nodded toward the cells. "You must have had some dealings with him." Morgan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's made donations to the town, sponsored the new schoolhouse, presents himself as a businessman and philanthropist." A pause. "But yes, I've had my suspicions. Nothing I could prove until now." Abigail, who had remained silent during Solomon's account, finally spoke. "My father has evidence that might help. A journal documenting Hargrove's activities in Wichita County." Morgan's eyebrows rose. "That would be mighty useful, Miss Hayes. But your father's ranch is a good 2 days' ride from here." "More importantly," Solomon interjected, "if these men don't report back, Hargrove will know something's wrong. He might move against your father immediately." Abigail paled at the thought. "We need to warn him." Morgan stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Telegraph office is just down the street. We could wire the sheriff in Wichita County, ask him to check on your father." "Assuming he's not already in Hargrove's pocket," Solomon said grimly. "Jim Beaumont's an old friend," Morgan replied. "Fought alongside me in the war. If there's one man in 3 counties who can't be bought, it's Jim." Solomon weighed their options. A telegraph might reach Wichita County within the hour. But if Hargrove had men watching the telegraph office, a reasonable precaution for someone orchestrating a land grab, the message could alert him to their location and intentions. "We need to question the prisoners first," Solomon decided. "See what they know about Hargrove's immediate plans." Morgan nodded, rising from his desk. I'll handle that. Meanwhile, Miss Hayes looks like she could use a proper meal and some rest. He turned to Abigail. The hotel across the street has clean rooms and decent food. My wife can bring over some fresh clothes for you. Abigail looked ready to protest, but Solomon placed a gentle hand on her arm. You've been through an ordeal. A few hours' rest won't change the outcome. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. But I want to know immediately what those men say. My father's life could depend on it. You have my word, Morgan assured her. With that settled, the sheriff's wife was summoned, a kind-faced woman who clucked sympathetically over Abigail's bruises and torn dress. She whisked the young woman away to the hotel, promising hot water for bathing and a home-cooked meal. Once they were alone with the prisoners, Morgan's demeanor shifted subtly. The courteous lawman receded, replaced by the hard-eyed veteran who had seen the worst men could do to one another. Now then, he said, approaching the cells, let's have a real conversation. For the next hour, Morgan questioned the prisoners with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to extracting truth from reluctant sources. Solomon observed silently, noting how the sheriff alternated between harsh demands and reasonable offers, playing the men against one another. The youngest broke first, as Solomon had expected. His name was Billy Rawlins, 22 years old, hired out of Fort Worth as a security consultant for Hargrove Enterprises. He'd been promised good money and legal protection for what he'd been told was a simple retrieval operation. Didn't sign up for kidnapping no woman, Billy insisted, his young face earnest beneath the thin mustache. Mr. Dalton said she'd gone missing, that her pa was worried sick. Said this Reed fella might be holding her against her will. Morgan exchanged a glance with Solomon. And you believed that? Billy's gaze dropped. $50 a week buys a lot of belief, Sheriff. The older prisoner, who finally identified himself as Frank Weber, corroborated Billy's account, but with greater cynicism. Knew it was shady business, he admitted, but Hargrove pays on time and keeps the law off your back, or so he claimed. He shot a resentful look at Morgan. What's Hargrove's interest in the Hayes Ranch? Solomon asked. Why that particular property? Frank shrugged. Above my pay grade. Dalton handles the specifics. We just do what we're told. And what were you told to do with Miss Hayes once you'd retrieved her? Morgan's voice had a dangerous edge. Frank and Billy exchanged uneasy glances. It was the third man, who had remained obstinately silent until now, who answered. Take her back to the holding place, he said flatly. Wait for further instructions. The stable where I found her, Solomon clarified. The man nodded once. And then, Morgan pressed, then nothing. Dalton would come for her. Take her to Hargrove. The man's expression remained impassive. What happened after wasn't our concern. Solomon felt a cold rage building in his chest. The casual disregard for Abigail's humanity, the willingness to participate in her suffering for mere money. It echoed too closely the rationalization he'd heard and used himself after Maple Creek. Just following orders. Not our concern. Where is Hargrove now? He asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. Wichita County, Frank replied. Staying at the Grand Hotel in the county seat, has an office there too. Conducts most of his business from those rooms. Morgan wrote this information down, then fixed the prisoners with a stern gaze. If any of what you've told us proves false accessory to kidnapping, will be the least of your charges. With the questioning complete, Morgan and Solomon stepped outside to confer privately. The day had warmed considerably, the mud from last night's rain already drying in the Texas sun. I believe them, Morgan said, lighting a cigarette. At least about the basic facts. Solomon nodded. They're hired muscle, not confidants. Probably don't know the half of what Hargrove's planning. Which leaves us with a decision. Morgan exhaled a stream of smoke. "Telegraph Beaumont in Wichita County, or handle this ourselves." "Both," Solomon said firmly. "Send the telegraph, but Abigail and I will ride for her father's ranch immediately." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "That's a hard journey for a wounded woman." "She's stronger than she looks." Solomon glanced toward the hotel where Abigail was resting. "And time isn't on our side. If Hargrove realizes his men have been captured, he'll move against Hayes directly." The sheriff considered this, then nodded slowly. "I'll draft the telegraph to the bureau. Short and cryptic enough that even if Hargrove's men intercept it, they won't gain much." He clapped Solomon on the shoulder. "But Reed, you should know, stepping back into this kind of fight after 10 years of peace. It changes a man." Solomon's hand went to his pocket, feeling the familiar weight of the watch. "I haven't known peace, Walter. Just absence. There's a difference." Morgan studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if something had been confirmed. "I'll arrange for fresh horses and supplies. You can leave within the hour." While Morgan handled these preparations, Solomon crossed to the hotel. He found Abigail in a small but clean room at the back of the building, dressed in a borrowed blue calico dress that nearly matched her fading bruises. Her dark hair was damp from washing braided neatly down her back. She looked up from the bowl of stew she'd been eating when he entered, her green eyes immediately alert. "What did they say?" she asked, setting aside the spoon. Solomon relayed the prisoner's information, watching her expression shift from concern to determination. "We need to leave for your father's ranch immediately," he concluded. "Sheriff Morgan is arranging horses and supplies." Abigail stood, wincing slightly but hiding it well. "I'm ready." "It's a hard 2 days' ride," Solomon warned. "Your injuries will hurt regardless of where I am," she finished firmly. "My father's life is at stake. A little discomfort is meaningless compared to that." Solomon recognized the steel in her voice, the same quality he'd seen in Emma when she'd insisted on accompanying him to the frontier despite its dangers. Some women were simply stronger than circumstance, fashioned from material that bent, but never broke. "Very well," he conceded. "We leave in an hour. Gather whatever supplies Mrs. Morgan brought you." As Abigail busied herself with preparations, Solomon found himself dwelling on Morgan's words. Stepping back into this kind of fight, it changes a man. The sheriff had been right about that, but not in the way he'd meant. Solomon wasn't concerned about what returning to violence might do to him. He was more troubled by what 10 years of self-imposed exile had already done. He'd built walls around his grief, made a fortress of his solitude. Now those walls were crumbling, forced down by Abigail's presence and Victor's ghost. What would remain of Solomon Reed when the dust settled? The captain who had once led men into battle, the husband and father who had lost everything, or someone new, forged in the fire of old wounds reopened. The pocket watch weighed heavy in his hand as he withdrew it. The golden cover gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the hotel window. For a decade, he'd carried it as a memorial, a physical reminder of time stopped. Now, for the first time, Solomon felt the faintest urge to wind it, to let time move forward again. But his fingers couldn't quite complete the motion. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. He returned the watch to his pocket as Morgan appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Telegraph sent," the sheriff reported. "But there's a complication. A rider just came in from the North Road. Says Jasper Dalton and a group of armed men were seen heading this way about an hour ago. They'll be here by midday." Solomon processed this information quickly. "They must have realized their men weren't coming back." Morgan nodded. "Changes our timeline. You and Miss Hayes need to leave now. Take the South Road out of town. I'll delay Dalton as long as I can." That's asking you to put yourself between Dalton and his goal, Solomon said quietly. It could get ugly. A hint of the old soldier showed in Morgan's smile. Been a while since San Angelo had any real excitement. Might do these townsfolk good to remember why they elected me sheriff in the first place. Solomon clasped the older man's hand. We'll bring back the evidence from Hayes. And Walter, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Morgan replied, his expression sobering. Just get that girl to her father, and whatever Hargrove's after, make sure he doesn't get it. Within 20 minutes, Solomon and Abigail were mounted on fresh horses and riding south out of San Angelo. Morgan had provided them with supplies, weapons, and a rough map of the fastest route to Wichita County. They would need to cross nearly 100 miles of Texas prairie, much of it sparsely populated with Dalton, potentially in pursuit. They rode hard until midday, stopping only when the horses needed rest. Abigail kept pace without complaint, though Solomon could see the strain in the tightness around her eyes. Her determination to reach her father overshadowed her physical discomfort. During a brief stop to water the horses at a small creek, Abigail approached Solomon with a handful of leaves she'd gathered from the bank. Willow bark, she explained, stripping the bark from the branches. For pain and inflammation, my mother taught me to recognize it. Solomon watched as she chewed some of the bark, her face puckering at the bitter taste. Your mother taught you a great deal about healing. Abigail nodded, offering him some of the bark. She believed everything that hurts can also heal if you understand its nature. A shadow crossed her face. I wish she could have taught me more before she died. Solomon accepted the bark, grimacing at the astringent flavor. How did your father meet her, if you don't mind my asking? A small smile touched Abigail's lips. He was surveying land near the Cherokee territory, got thrown from his horse, and broke his leg. My mother found him, brought him back to her village to heal. Her eyes took on a faraway look. He said he fell in love watching her work, the way her hands moved, gentle but certain. How she spoke to the plants as she gathered them, thanking them for their sacrifice. They had a good marriage. Solomon's thoughts drifted to Emma, to their own brief years of happiness. The best, Abigail confirmed. Even when others disapproved a white rancher and a Cherokee woman, they built something beautiful together. Her expression clouded. After she died, the crescent moon felt empty for a long time, but we managed, until Hargrove came. Solomon helped her remount, noting how she moved more freely after chewing the willow bark. Your father sounds like a good man. The best I know, she said simply. Strong, fair, stubborn as a mule when he believes he's right. She adjusted her hat against the midday sun. You remind me of him, actually. The comparison caught Solomon off guard. It had been years since anyone had paid him a compliment, longer still, since one had mattered. They continued riding south, the landscape gradually changing from the scrubby terrain around San Angelo to more verdant rolling hills. By late afternoon, they had covered nearly 30 miles, good progress, but still less than a third of their journey. As dusk approached, Solomon led them toward a stand of cottonwoods that would provide shelter for the night. They made camp efficiently, Solomon building a small, nearly smokeless fire, while Abigail tended to the horses. Over a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Abigail broached the subject they'd been avoiding all day. You never finished telling me about Maple Creek, she said quietly. About your history with Hargrove. Solomon stared into the small flames, considering how much to share. The full truth of Maple Creek was a burden he'd carried alone for decades. But circumstances had forged an alliance between them that required trust. Victor Hargrove was the most decorated officer in our regiment, he began, his voice low. Brilliant tactician, fearless in battle. At Antietam, He led a charge that broke through Confederate lines when everything seemed lost. I was there, saw him take a bullet to the shoulder and keep fighting. Abigail listened intently, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. Later that same day, his position was overrun. I led a counterattack, pulled him to safety. Solomon's jaw tightened at the memory. He said I saved his life, said he'd never forget it. And that created a bond between you. Solomon nodded. In war, such things forge connections stronger than blood. For the next 2 years we fought side by side. He rose to colonel, made me his captain, trusted me above all others. He fell silent, gathering his thoughts before continuing. By 64, the war had changed us all. Victory seemed certain, but the fighting dragged on. Men grew brutal, impatient. Solomon's gaze remained fixed on the fire. We were behind enemy lines in Tennessee when we came to Maple Creek. Small farming village, mostly women and children. Intelligence suggested they were supplying Confederate guerrillas with food and information. Abigail leaned forward slightly. And Hargrove ordered the village destroyed. Not at first. Solomon's voice grew hoarse with the memory. He ordered a search for weapons supplies, anything that would confirm the intelligence. A woman approached me, while the men were searching, middle-aged, dignified, despite her fear. She wore a blue shawl with white flowers embroidered along the edge. He could see her still standing in the dusty street, her eyes pleading but proud. She begged me to stop the soldiers from destroying their homes, said they were just simple farmers, that any food given to rebels had been taken by force. Solomon swallowed hard. I told her to speak to Colonel Hargrove, that he was in charge. What happened? Abigail prompted gently when he fell silent. A shot was fired. No one knew who or why. Panic erupted. Our men, already on edge, began firing. Victor, Solomon's hands clenched into fists. Victor didn't order them to stop. He ordered them to burn everything. Said we needed to make an example to show what happened to those who aided the enemy. And you? The question hung between them, heavy with judgment. Solomon had already passed on himself 1,000 times. I hesitated. He admitted the word bitter on his tongue. Questioned the order, but privately. By the time I found the courage to oppose him openly, it was too late. 27 civilians dead. An entire village erased from the map. Abigail's expression remained compassionate, free of the condemnation Solomon had expected. You've carried this a long time, she said, echoing her words from their earlier conversation. Not as long as the dead, Solomon replied grimly. After Maple Creek, something changed between Victor and me. The trust was gone. I requested transfer to another unit, but before it could be processed, we engaged in the battle at Yellow Creek. Victor was reported killed. I was wounded, sent home to recover. His hand moved unconsciously to his left side, where the scar from a Confederate bullet still pained him in cold weather. And when you returned home, Abigail began, I found Emma and Lily, Solomon confirmed. Built this life in Texas, tried to forget the war, forget Maple Creek. His eyes met hers across the fire, until the flood took them too. Abigail was silent for a long moment, absorbing the weight of his confession. Then she rose and moved to sit beside him, her shoulder barely brushing his, a small gesture of comfort that spoke volumes. My mother believed that healing begins when we voice our wounds, she said softly. That secrets fester like poison in a cut. Solomon considered her words, feeling something shift within him, not absolution, but perhaps the first tentative step toward it. For 10 years, he'd locked away the memories of Maple Creek, of his failure to stop the slaughter. Speaking them aloud to Abigail hadn't diminished their horror, but somehow made it more bearable. "Your mother was a wise woman," he said finally. Abigail smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face, despite the fading bruises. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said, 'Still waters run deep.'" They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned low. The night air cooled around them, stars emerging in a velvet sky, unmarred by clouds. In the distance, a coyote called its lonely cry, echoing across the open land. "We should rest," Solomon said eventually. "Long ride tomorrow." Abigail nodded, but made no move to return to her side of the fire. Instead, she withdrew a small pouch from her pocket and opened it, revealing a scrap of faded fabric. "This was my mother's," she said, holding it, so Solomon could see the delicate embroidery blue flowers on white cloth, their design familiar in a way that made his heart stutter. "The only thing I have left of her. She was working on a shawl, but never finished it before she died." Solomon stared at the fabric, his mind racing. Blue flowers on white, like the woman at Maple Creek. But it couldn't be. "Your mother," he said carefully. "She was at Maple Creek, wasn't she?" Abigail's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you know? The shawl. The woman who approached me wore one with the same pattern." Solomon felt dizzy with the implications. "Your mother survived Maple Creek." Abigail nodded slowly. "She was visiting her cousin's village when the soldiers came. She escaped into the woods with a few others while the shooting started." Her voice grew soft. "She never spoke of it much. It pained her too deeply. But she would wake screaming sometimes, calling names I didn't recognize." Solomon struggled to process this revelation. "And your father, Samuel Hayes. He met her after. He found her and the other survivors wandering near the border of his survey area, brought them food blankets, helped them reach safety." Abigail's eyes shone with quiet pride. "When the others moved on to rejoin the main Cherokee lands, my mother stayed. Said Samuel had a good heart. They married the following spring. The coincidence seemed too great to be mere chance. The woman from Maple Creek, whose plea Solomon had ignored, had survived to become Abigail's mother. And now, a decade later, Solomon found himself protecting her daughter from the very man who had ordered the massacre. "There's more," Abigail said, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "Something I haven't told you. Something no one knows, except my father." Solomon waited, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to reveal. "Samuel Hayes isn't my birth father." Abigail clutched the fabric scrap tightly. "My real father died at Maple Creek before I was born. My mother was carrying me when the soldiers came." The revelation hit Solomon like a physical blow. "You were born of Maple Creek." Abigail nodded. "My mother named me Abigail after her own mother. But my Cherokee name, the one she whispered to me when no one else could hear, is Unaha, she who remembers. And this treasure Hargrove is seeking on your father's land," Solomon began, pieces falling into place. "Is my mother's journal," Abigail confirmed. "She documented everything, the massacre, the names of those who died, the officer who gave the order." Her eyes held Solomon's steadily. "She recognized Hargrove when he came to our ranch. He didn't remember her, she'd been just another face in the crowd to him. But she knew, and she told my father." Hayes has been gathering evidence against Hargrove, Solomon realized. The journal would be proof of war crimes, along with testimony from survivors, Abigail added. "My father has spent years collecting accounts, building a case. He was preparing to present it to federal authorities when Hargrove arrived in the county." Her expression hardened. Somehow, Hargrove learned about the journal. That's why he wants our land to find and destroy the evidence." Solomon sat back, stunned by the magnitude of what she'd revealed. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about justice long delayed and a powerful man's desperate attempt to escape it. "Where is the journal now?" he asked. "Hidden, in a place only my father and I know." Abigail's voice was steady, resolved. "Hargrove can tear apart every inch of the crescent moon and never find it." Solomon nodded, newfound respect for Samuel Hayes warming his chest. The man had not only saved survivors of Maple Creek, but had spent years working to bring the perpetrator to justice, all while raising a child, not his own, as his beloved daughter. "Your father is an honorable man," Solomon said softly. "Yes," Abigail agreed. "And now you understand why we must reach him before Hargrove does. It's not just his life at stake, it's the truth about Maple Creek. Justice for those who died, including my birth father." Solomon felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. This journey had become more than a rescue mission or even a confrontation with his past. It was a chance to right a wrong that had haunted him for decades. "We'll ride at first light," he promised. "Push the horses as hard as we dare." Abigail reached out her slender fingers, briefly touching his weathered hand. "Thank you, Solomon, for everything." The simple gesture of gratitude affected him more deeply than he could have anticipated. For years he'd avoided human connection, convinced he deserved his isolation as penance for his failures. But in Abigail's eyes he saw not judgment, but understanding. Not absolution that would be too simple, but the possibility of redemption. They slept in shifts that night, each taking watch while the other rested. Solomon's dreams, when they came, were fragmented images of Emma and Lily, of the woman in the blue shawl of Victor Hargrove, giving orders that couldn't be unheard. But for the first time in years, he didn't wake gasping for breath, trapped in the paralysis of grief and guilt. Instead, he woke to dawn breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Abigail was already up, tending the small fire where coffee brewed in a battered tin pot. "Slept better than I expected," she admitted when she saw him stirring. "Something about sharing burdens makes them lighter, I suppose." Solomon nodded, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. The bitter liquid was bracing exactly what he needed to focus his thoughts on the day ahead. They broke camp efficiently, leaving no trace of their presence beyond the cold ashes of their fire. The horses, well rested and fed, seemed eager to move, sensing perhaps the urgency of their riders. The second day's journey took them through increasingly populated areas. Small farmsteads dotted the landscape, fields of young corn and wheat stretching toward the horizon. They avoided the main roads and larger settlements, keeping to less traveled paths where Dalton's men would be less likely to follow. By midday, they had covered another 30 miles, pushing themselves and their mounts to the limit of endurance. During a brief stop to rest, the horses, Solomon climbed a small rise to survey their back trail, watching for any sign of pursuit. The prairie stretched behind them, seemingly empty beneath the vast Texas sky. But Solomon's instincts, honed by years of war and survival, told him they were being followed. Not closely enough to see yet, but followed nonetheless. "Dalton?" Abigail asked when he rejoined her, reading his concern in the set of his shoulders. "Most likely," Solomon confirmed. "We've made good time, but so have they. How far to Wichita County? Another day's ride at least. We'll need to push harder, find a place to lose them, or confront them on ground of our choosing." Abigail's expression was resolute. "Then we push harder." They rode on the landscape, gradually changing as they moved northward. The rolling hills gave way to flatter terrain, broken occasionally by stands of oak and mesquite. Water became scarcer, forcing them to ration their supplies carefully. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its westward descent, they crested a rise and saw a small ranch nestled in the valley below. Smoke rose from the chimney cattle, grazed in a nearby pasture, and a windmill creaked in the gentle breeze, signs of civilization that promised rest and possibly assistance. "We could ask for help," Abigail suggested, hope coloring her voice. "Fresh horses, at least." Solomon studied the ranch with a cautious eye. "Could be friendly. Could also be trouble. Hargrove's influence stretches wide." After a moment's consideration, he made his decision. "We'll approach carefully. If anything seems amiss, we ride on immediately." As they drew closer to the ranch house, a dog began to bark, alerting the occupants to their presence. A moment later, the door opened and a figure stepped onto the porch, a woman in her 30s, a shotgun held confidently in her hands. "That's far enough," she called as they approached the yard. "State your business." Solomon reined in his horse, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "Just passing through, ma'am, looking for a place to water our horses." The woman studied them skeptically, taking in their trail-worn appearance, the quality of their mounts, the way Abigail sat her horse with the careful posture of someone nursing injuries. "You're running from something," she stated flatly. "Or someone." "Yes, ma'am," Solomon admitted, seeing no point in deception. "But we're not outlaws, if that's your concern." Her gaze sharpened. "My husband's in town. Won't be back till sundown." "We'll be gone before then," Solomon assured her. "Just need water, maybe directions to the quickest route to Wichita County." At the mention of their destination, something shifted in the woman's expression. "You folks know Samuel Hayes?" Abigail straightened in her saddle. "He's my father." The shotgun lowered slightly. "Elizabeth Hayes' girl, the one with the Cherokee blood." "Yes," Abigail confirmed, surprise evident in her voice. "Did you know my mother?" The woman nodded, her wariness giving way to a more complex emotion. "She helped deliver my first child when the doctor couldn't get through a snowstorm. Saved both our lives with her knowledge of herbs." She lowered the shotgun completely. "Name's Martha Wilson. You'd better come inside." Inside the modest ranch house, Martha poured coffee and set out a plate of cornbread, while Solomon and Abigail took turns explaining their situation, keeping certain details vague, but emphasizing the urgency of reaching the Crescent Moon Ranch. "Hargrove," Martha spat the name like a curse. "That man's been nothing but trouble since he arrived. Offered to buy our place 3 months back. When James refused, our best bull turned up dead the next week. Poisoned water hole, most likely." "Has he approached many ranchers in the area?" Solomon asked. "Most everyone between here and Wichita County," Martha confirmed. "Some sold willingly, the price was fair, even generous. Others held out." Her expression darkened. "Accidents tend to follow the holdouts. Barn fires, livestock dying. One family's son was beaten nearly to death in town. No witnesses, of course." Abigail exchanged a glance with Solomon. The pattern was clear, systematic intimidation, escalating violence, all aimed at acquiring land for reasons that still remained unclear. "We need to reach my father," Abigail said urgently. "Hargrove's men took me to force his compliance. Now that I've escaped, my father will be in even greater danger." Martha nodded grimly. "The Hayes place is still a good 40 miles north. You won't make it before dark, and these roads aren't safe at night, and especially not with Hargrove's men about." "We can't afford to wait until morning," Solomon insisted. "Didn't say you should." Martha rose from the table. "James keeps a wagon ready, false bottom, hidden compartment." uses it to transport certain goods without attracting attention. Smuggling, Solomon raised an eyebrow. Martha's expression was unapologetic. Medicine, books, things people need that Hargrove's men have been confiscating on the roads. She met Solomon's gaze directly. We do what we must to resist tyranny, Mr. Reed. I suspect you understand that better than most. Solomon inclined his head, acknowledging the truth in her words. The wagon's slower than riding, Martha continued, but it'll get you through any checkpoints Hargrove's men have established. They've learned not to look too closely at our deliveries. James has an arrangement with some of the less principled among them. You'd do this for us? Abigail asked clearly, moved by the offer. For Elizabeth Hayes' daughter. Martha smiled a warm expression that softened her weathered features. Without question. Your mother saved what I hold most dear. The least I can do is help her child in return. While Martha prepared the wagon, Solomon took the opportunity to check their back trail once more. From the barn loft, he had a clear view of the countryside they'd traversed. In the distance, perhaps 5 miles back, a cloud of dust betrayed the presence of riders, multiple horsemen moving at speed. Dalton, he murmured, calculating distances and times. The pursuers would reach the Wilson Ranch within the hour. He descended to find Martha and Abigail loading supplies into the wagon, food, water, extra ammunition for the rifle and revolver Solomon carried. Riders coming, he reported grimly. Less than an hour behind us. Martha's expression hardened. Then we'd best get you on your way. She turned to Abigail. There's a change of clothes in the wagon, plain work dresses like I wear, and a hat to hide your face. From a distance, you'll look like any farmer's wife. Solomon helped Abigail into the wagon, then turned to Martha. They'll question you when they arrive. Let them, she replied, steel in her voice. I've dealt with their kind before. By the time they're done asking questions, you'll be halfway to the county line. They're dangerous men, Solomon warned. Martha patted the shotgun she'd set aside earlier. So am I, Mr. Reed. So am I. With a final nod of gratitude, Solomon climbed onto the wagon seat beside Abigail. The horses, fresh and well-fed, moved forward eagerly at his command. As they pulled away from the ranch, Martha Wilson stood on her porch, a solitary figure of defiance against forces that had cowed many others. Remarkable woman, Abigail commented as the ranch receded behind them. Solomon nodded, thinking of Emma, of Abigail herself, of Martha Wilson standing guard over her home with unwavering resolve. Texas breeds them strong, he said simply. The wagon followed a different route than they would have taken on horseback, less direct but also less exposed. Martha had explained that a network of small ranchers and farmers had established alternate pathways to avoid Hargrove's checkpoints, sharing information about safe passages through lands increasingly under his control. As dusk fell, they reached a river crossing that marked the border of Wichita County. The water ran shallow here, easy for the wagon to ford. On the far bank, Solomon paused to survey their surroundings. No signs of pursuit, but the gathering darkness made it difficult to be certain. "How much farther to your father's ranch?" he asked as they continued northward. "About 20 miles, Abigail replied, her voice tight with anticipation and worry. "If we keep this pace, we could arrive before midnight." Solomon nodded, though privately he doubted they would reach the Crescent Moon Ranch unhindered. Hargrove's influence was strongest in Wichita County, and the closer they came to their destination, the greater the danger. His concerns proved well-founded when an hour later they rounded a bend in the road to find a barricade erected across the path. Logs and brush piled to obstruct passage. 2 mounted men waited beside it, rifles ready. Solomon reacted instantly, pulling the wagon off the road and into the shelter of a small copse of trees before they were spotted. They abandoned the wagon there, gathering only essential supplies before proceeding on foot through the darkness. The night was their ally now. Solomon led them through fields and pastures, avoiding roads and open spaces where they might be seen. Abigail kept pace without complaint, her determination to reach her father overriding the pain of her injuries and the exhaustion of their journey. It was nearly midnight when they crested a small hill and saw lights in the distance, the Crescent Moon Ranch, its buildings dark, except for a single window glowing in what Abigail identified as her father's study. "He's still there," she whispered, relief evident in her voice. "Still alive?" But as they drew closer, Solomon's experienced eye noted details that tempered that relief. No movement around the outbuildings, no ranch hands visible, no horses in the corral that should have held at least a few mounts for night riders checking the herds. "Something's wrong," he murmured, pulling Abigail to a halt behind a large oak tree. "The ranch is too quiet." Abigail tensed beside him, seeing now what he had already observed. Hargrove's men, most likely. Solomon unslung his rifle, checking that it was loaded and ready. "We need to approach carefully. There could be guards posted." They circled the ranch buildings, moving from shadow to shadow with painstaking care. Solomon's war experience guided them, helping them avoid potential sentry positions and sight lines. As they neared the main house, the silence became even more oppressive, not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping ranch, but the tense stillness of a trap waiting to be sprung. The light they had seen came from a window on the ground floor, partially obscured by curtains. Solomon gestured for Abigail to stay back as he crept closer, seeking a vantage point to see inside without being detected. Through a narrow gap in the curtains, he could make out a portion of what appeared to be a study. A large desk dominated the visible space, papers scattered across its surface. A man's hand rested on the desk, an older hand weathered by sun and work, but steady. Samuel Hayes Solomon presumed. But he couldn't see the man's face, or determine if he was alone. He retreated to where Abigail waited, anxiety evident in her tense posture. "Your father's in his study," Solomon reported in a whisper. "Can't tell if he's alone or if Hargrove's men are with him." "There's a back entrance," Abigail replied equally quietly. "Through the kitchen. The door sticks makes noise unless you know exactly how to open it." Solomon considered their options. If Hargrove's men were indeed inside, a direct approach could put Samuel Hayes in immediate danger. But continuing to wait outside while a potential threat loomed was equally problematic. "Show me this back door," he decided finally. "We'll try to get inside undetected, assess the situation before making our next move." Abigail led him around to the rear of the house, staying in the shadows of the outbuildings. The kitchen door was solid oak, well maintained, but old enough to have developed quirks over the years. "You have to lift up slightly as you turn the handle," Abigail explained, demonstrating the motion without actually touching the door. "Then push with your shoulder right here." Solomon nodded, memorizing the technique. "Wait here until I signal it's clear." "No." Abigail's voice was firm despite its softness. "This is my home. My father, I'm coming with you." Solomon recognized the futility of arguing with her. The same determination that had kept her going through kidnapping, rescue, and a grueling journey would not falter now at the threshold of her goal. "Stay behind me," he conceded, "and if I say run, you run. No questions." Abigail nodded her agreement, her green eyes reflecting the starlight as she looked up at him. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed through shared danger and revelation. Then Solomon turned to the door, applying Abigail's instructions with careful precision. The handle turned silently, the door swinging inward without the betraying creak she had warned would come from improper handling. The kitchen beyond was dark, and still illuminated only by faint moonlight filtering through the windows. Solomon entered first, rifle ready, scanning for any sign of threat. Abigail followed close behind, her knowledge of the house's layout, guiding them through the shadowed rooms toward the study where they had seen light. As they approached, voices became audible, a low murmur of male conversation too indistinct to make out words, but clear enough to confirm that Samuel Hayes was not alone. Solomon held up a hand, signaling Abigail to wait, as he crept closer to the partially open study door. "Patience is wearing thin, Mr. Hayes." The voice was cultured, authoritative, with the hint of a southern drawl. "You know what I want. You know what will happen if you continue to refuse me. I told you, Hargrove, I don't have what you're looking for." This voice was older, steady, despite an undertone of pain. "Tearing apart my ranch won't change that fact." "Perhaps not," the first voice, Hargrove's voice, replied smoothly. "But I wonder if watching your ranch burn to the ground might loosen your tongue, or perhaps news of your daughter's condition would prove motivating." Solomon risked a glance around the door frame. The study was a handsome room, walls lined with bookshelves, a large desk positioned before windows that would in daylight offer a view of the ranch. Behind the desk sat an older man, Samuel Hayes, Abigail's father. His face bore evidence of recent beating. One eye swollen shut, a trail of dried blood at the corner of his mouth. But his posture remained unbowed, his one good eye fixed defiantly on his interrogator. And there, standing before the desk with his back to the door, was Victor Hargrove. Even from behind, Solomon would have known him anywhere. The straight shoulders, the perfectly tailored coat, the silver-streaked dark hair cut with military precision. Victor Hargrove, risen from the dead, standing in Samuel Hayes's study, as though the last decade had never happened. Solomon withdrew silently, returning to where Abigail waited. Her questioning look demanded information. "Your father is alive," he whispered, relieved to deliver this news at least. "Injured, but alive, and defiant." "Hargrove?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Solomon nodded grimly. "In the flesh, along with at least one other man I could see, probably more, in other parts of the house." Abigail's expression hardened. "We need a distraction. Something to separate them so we can get to my father." Solomon considered their limited options. A frontal assault was too risky with Hayes directly in Hargrove's power. But perhaps... "The barn," he suggested. "If it caught fire, they'd have to respond. In the confusion, we could reach your father." Abigail shook her head emphatically. "Not the barn. There's another way." She pointed toward a door at the far end of the hallway. "My father's bedroom connects to the study through a private door. It's hidden behind a bookcase, designed during border raids, when quick escape might be necessary." "Can we access it without being seen?" "Through the window," Abigail confirmed. "I've done it 100 times since I was a girl." Solomon's respect for the Hayes family's foresight increased. "Lead the way." They retreated from the house as silently as they had entered, circling around to the side, where Samuel Hayes's bedroom window faced away from the main yard. The window was latched but not locked, another sign of the ranch's usual security being compromised by Hargrove's occupation. Abigail opened it with practiced ease, slipping inside with Solomon close behind. The bedroom beyond was dark and undisturbed, suggesting Hargrove's men had focused their search elsewhere. "The door is behind the portrait of my grandfather," Abigail whispered, moving confidently, despite the darkness. "Press the lower right corner of the frame, and it releases the latch." Solomon followed her guidance, finding the hidden mechanism exactly where she'd described. The bookcase swung silently inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow passage. It opens into the study behind another bookcase, Abigail explained. We can see into the room through a small gap before we enter. They proceeded carefully down the short passage, conscious that any noise might alert Hargrove to their presence. At the far end, as Abigail had promised, a thin sliver of light showed where the bookcase in the study left a narrow viewing gap. Solomon peered through, taking in the full scene that had been partially obscured during his earlier glimpse. Samuel Hayes still sat behind his desk, his injuries more extensive than Solomon had initially realized. Opposite him stood Victor Hargrove, looking remarkably unchanged from Solomon's memories, perhaps more gray in his hair, a few more lines around his eyes, but still possessing the commanding presence that had once inspired men to follow him into battle. A third man lounged against the wall near the main door, one of Hargrove's hired guns, his posture relaxed, but his hand never far from his holstered revolver. "Your daughter is quite resourceful, Hayes," Hargrove was saying, his tone conversational despite the underlying menace, "managing to escape my men finding assistance from unexpected quarters." He paced slowly before the desk. "But it's only a temporary reprieve. My men will find her, bring her back. And when they do, I'll make sure you're there to witness her persuasion." Hayes's expression remained impassive, though Solomon could see the effort it cost him. "You're assuming she was taken against her will?" the rancher replied evenly. "Perhaps she simply left. Decided your hospitality wasn't to her liking." Hargrove laughed, a sound without humor. "Always defiant. I admire that quality, Hayes. It's becoming increasingly rare in this modern age." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. "But defiance has its limits. Every man breaks eventually. Every single one." The threat hung in the air between them, its implications clear. Solomon felt Abigail tense beside him, her breath catching at the sight of her father's condition and the danger he still faced. "We need to act now," she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion, "before they hurt him more." Solomon placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Wait," he breathed. "One guard in sight. Need to know if there are others nearby before we move." As if in answer to his concern, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the study. The door opened, admitting another of Hargrove's men, a familiar figure that made Solomon's jaw tighten. Jasper Dalton. "Sir," Dalton addressed Hargrove, his manner respectful but urgent. "Riders approaching from the south. Could be the sheriff and his men." Hargrove's expression darkened. "How many?" "At least 6, possibly more." "Morgan," Solomon murmured, hope rising in his chest. The sheriff had followed them after all, bringing reinforcements. Hargrove straightened his decision made quickly. "Prepare to leave. Bring Hayes. We'll continue this conversation at a more secure location." "And the ranch?" Dalton asked, his meaning clear, even without elaboration. Hargrove's smile was cold. "Ensure there's nothing left for the sheriff to find, especially in the old well." "The well?" Solomon glanced at Abigail, seeing recognition flash in her eyes. The location of the hidden journal, it seemed, was not as secret as she had believed. "Now," Solomon whispered, readying his rifle, "while they're distracted." With a swift movement, he pushed open the hidden door, stepping into the study with his weapon raised. Abigail followed close behind, her father's shotgun, retrieved from a rack in the bedroom, clutched in her hands. "Hello, Victor," Solomon said, his voice steady, despite the rush of emotions at confronting his former commanding officer face to face. "Been a long time." Hargrove froze, genuine shock, registering on his features for perhaps the first time in decades. "Read impossible." And the moment stretched between them, charged with the weight of shared history and betrayal. Then Dalton's hand moved toward his gun, and the room erupted into chaos. Time seemed to slow as Dalton reached for his gun. Solomon's rifle swung toward the movement, but before he could fire, Abigail's shotgun roared beside him. The blast caught Dalton in the shoulder, spinning him against the wall with a cry of pain and surprise. The guard by the door drew his weapon, but Solomon was already shifting his aim, squeezing the trigger with the calm precision that had once made him the finest marksman in the 9th Illinois. The man dropped his unfired revolver, clattering to the floor. Through the gun smoke, Victor Hargrove stood motionless, his aristocratic features a mask of calculation. Unlike his men, he made no move toward the pistol visible in his waistband. "Solomon Reed," he said, his voice carrying the same commanding tone Solomon remembered from 100 battlefields. "Back from the dead, it seems." "I could say the same about you, Victor." Solomon kept his rifle trained on his former commander's chest. "Yellow Creek was supposed to have claimed you." A thin smile crossed Hargrove's face. "Reports of my demise were strategic." His gaze shifted to Abigail, who had moved to her father's side, one hand on his shoulder, while keeping her shotgun leveled at Hargrove. "I see you've met Miss Hayes, quite the spirited young woman." Samuel Hayes looked up at his daughter with a mixture of relief and concern. "Abigail, are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Father." She squeezed his shoulder gently. "Better than you, it seems." Hayes' battered face creased in a painful smile. "Nothing that won't heal." Dalton groaned from his position against the wall, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Hargrove spared him the briefest glance before returning his attention to Solomon. "Your timing is impeccable, old friend," he said, as though they were meeting at a social gathering rather than at gunpoint. "But ultimately futile. Sheriff Morgan and his men are still minutes away. My reinforcements are considerably closer." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of booted feet echoed from elsewhere in the house, Hargrove's men responding to the gunshots. "Abigail," Solomon said, without taking his eyes off Hargrove, "get your father out through the passage. Head for the barn. Find horses. I'll be right behind you." "No," she replied firmly. "We leave together or not at all." Samuel Hayes struggled to his feet, grimacing with pain. "Listen to him, Abigail. Hargrove has at least 6 men in the house." "7, actually," Hargrove corrected with that same unsettling calm, "plus 3 more watching the perimeter. Quite a force to overcome even for the legendary Captain Reed." Solomon's mind raced, calculating odds avenues of escape potential strategies. The hidden passage offered their best chance, but someone needed to delay pursuit. "The journal," he said, suddenly a gambit to buy time. "That's what this is about, isn't it? The evidence of what happened at Maple Creek." A flicker of genuine emotion, anger perhaps, or fear crossed Hargrove's face. Maple Creek was a military necessity. History is written by the victor's Captain Reed. You of all people should understand that. "I understand that 27 civilians died," Solomon replied, his voice hardening. "Women, children, people who posed no threat to anyone." Hargrove's expression darkened. "They were aiding the enemy. The intelligence was clear. The intelligence was wrong." Samuel Hayes interjected, his voice strained but strong. "There were no weapons in that village, no rebel supplies. Just families trying to survive a war they never asked for." Hargrove's gaze snapped to Hayes, cold fury replacing his cultivated calm. "You weren't there. You know nothing of the realities we faced." "My wife was there," Hayes shot back. "Elizabeth saw everything, recorded everything, including your orders to burn the village with people still inside their homes." The footsteps in the hallway grew louder. Time was running out. "The passage! Now!" Solomon ordered, taking a step backward to cover their retreat. This time Abigail didn't argue. She helped her father toward the hidden door, supporting his weight as he limped across the study. "You can't run forever, Reed," Hargrove called, his composure returning. "The journal won't save you. Nothing will. Some sins can't be washed clean." Solomon paused at the threshold of the passage. "You're right about that, Victor," he said quietly. "Which is why I'm done running." With that, he backed through the doorway, pulling the bookcase closed behind him just as the study door burst open, admitting Hargrove's reinforcements. The passage was dark, but Abigail and Samuel were already moving toward the bedroom beyond. Solomon followed, closing and barricading the bedroom door behind them to slow pursuit from that direction as well. "The window," Abigail urged, helping her father toward their entry point. Samuel went first, grimacing as he eased his injured body through the opening. Abigail followed, with Solomon bringing up the rear just as pounding began on the bedroom door. Outside, the night air carried the sounds of approaching riders, Sheriff Morgan and his posse still minutes away, but drawing closer with each passing second. If they could reach the barn, find horses, perhaps they could meet the sheriff's party before Hargrove's men caught them. They moved as swiftly as Samuel's injuries would allow, keeping to the shadows of the ranch buildings. The barn loomed ahead, its large doors standing partially open, an invitation and possibly a trap. Solomon took the lead as they approached, rifle ready. "Stay here," he whispered, motioning for Abigail and Samuel to wait in the shelter of a water trough. "I'll check inside." The barn's interior was shadowed, and still the smell of hay and horses hanging in the warm air. Solomon moved cautiously down the center aisle, alert for any movement or sound that might betray an ambush. 3 horses stood in stalls along the far wall, saddled and ready, clear evidence of Hargrove's planned departure with Samuel Hayes in tow. No guards were visible, but Solomon checked every stall and shadowed corner before returning to where Abigail and her father waited. 3 horses, he reported, saddled and ready. No sign of Hargrove's men, but they can't be far. "The barn has a rear exit," Samuel explained, his voice tight with pain. "Leads directly to the north pasture. We can avoid the main yard entirely." They moved inside, Abigail supporting her father, while Solomon led the way toward the horses. Samuel insisted on mounting unassisted, despite his injuries, his face gray with effort, but his determination unwavering. Abigail swung into the saddle of the second horse with practiced ease, while Solomon took the third, a powerful black stallion that pranced nervously beneath him. "This way," Samuel directed, pointing toward a small door at the rear of the barn. Just as they were about to urge their mounts forward, a voice rang out from the hayloft above. "I wouldn't if I were you." Solomon looked up to see Jasper Dalton peering down the barrel of a rifle, his wounded shoulder apparently not impeding his aim. Blood stained his fancy vest, but his hand was steady on the weapon. "Impressive recovery time," Solomon remarked, his own rifle still in its scabbard, out of immediate reach. Dalton's smile was strained with pain. "The lady's shotgun made more noise than damage. Lucky for me." "Not so lucky for you now," came another voice from the barn door. Sheriff Walter Morgan stood in the entrance, his revolver drawn, and pointed directly at Dalton. Behind him, several deputies fanned out, weapons at the ready. Dalton's rifle wavered, then steadied again. "You're outnumbered, Sheriff. Hargrove has men all over the ranch." "Had men," Morgan corrected. "Most of them are currently face down in the dirt, with my deputies standing over them." His weathered face creased in a grim smile. "Turns out hired guns have limited loyalty when faced with superior numbers and the law." Dalton's expression flickered with uncertainty. "Hargrove, is surrounded in the main house, Morgan finished for him. Though I expect he's looking for an exit strategy about now. The sheriff nodded toward Solomon and the haze. You folks all right? We've been better, Samuel replied dryly, still sitting tall in his saddle despite his injuries. Morgan turned his attention back to Dalton. Now, son, you have about 3 seconds to drop that rifle before my men ventilate you from several directions simultaneously. For a tense moment, it seemed Dalton might choose death over surrender. Then, with a muttered curse, he lowered his weapon. Wise choice, Morgan acknowledged as deputies moved to secure the prisoner. Mr. Hayes, you look like you could use a doctor. Samuel shook his head. Later, there's something more urgent. He looked at his daughter. Abigail, the journal. We need to retrieve it now, before anything else happens. Abigail nodded, understanding immediately. The well. Hargrove knows, Solomon warned. I heard him mention it to Dalton. Then we'd better hurry, Samuel urged already, turning his horse toward the rear door. They emerged into the north pasture, Morgan and 2 deputies accompanying them, while the rest secured the barn and Dalton. The old well stood about 50 yards from the barn, its weathered stone structure barely visible in the moonlight. As they approached, a shot rang out from the darkness beyond the well. Solomon reacted instantly, pushing Abigail's head down while scanning for the shooter. There, one of the deputies shouted, pointing toward a figure moving among the shadows. More gunfire erupted, bullets whining past, as Morgan and his men returned fire. Solomon urged his horse forward, putting himself between the haze and the unseen attacker. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette, Victor Hargrove, moving with surprising agility for a man his age, making his way toward the well ahead of them. He's going for the journal, Solomon called to Morgan, spurring his horse into a gallop. Hargrove reached the well, first dropping to his knees beside it and reaching down into the darkness. Solomon dismounted in a fluid motion rifle in hand, closing the distance with swift strides. It's over, Victor, he called. Hargrove looked up, something clutched in his hand. A small oilskin package retrieved from some hidden niche within the well's structure. His face, illuminated by moonlight, showed none of the composed arrogance from earlier. Instead, there was a wild desperation in his eyes. It will never be over, he snarled, drawing his pistol with his free hand. Solomon raised his rifle, but before either man could fire another shot, cracked through the night. Hargrove staggered, the pistol dropping from his grasp. He looked down in surprise at the spreading stain on his chest, then back up. Abigail stood a few yards away, her father's revolver steady in her hand, smoke still curling from its barrel. That's for my mother, she said, her voice surprisingly calm. And for everyone at Maple Creek, who never had a chance to see justice done. Hargrove sank to his knees, the oilskin package still clutched in his hand. You don't understand, he gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. I was following orders too, from higher up, powerful men who needed the war to continue. Solomon approached cautiously, keeping his rifle trained on the wounded man. What men Victor Who was behind Maple Creek? But Hargrove's strength was fading rapidly. His eyes sought Solomon's, a strange mixture of defiance and pleading in their depths. We were friends once, he whispered, brothers in arms. Remember that, at least. With a final effort, he thrust the oilskin package toward Solomon. The truth, it's all here. Use it wisely, more dangerous than you know. His hand fell, the package dropping onto the dusty ground beside the well. Victor Hargrove, once the most decorated officer in the 9th Illinois, slumped forward and lay still. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Sheriff Morgan approached, kneeling to check for signs of life. Finding none, he looked up at Solomon with a somber expression. It's done, he said simply. But Solomon knew it wasn't not yet. He picked up the oilskin package, feeling its weight in his hands. Inside lay the truth about Maple Creek, about Elizabeth Hayes's experience, about crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. Abigail moved to his side, her father limping behind her with a deputy's support. Without a word, Solomon handed her the package. It was her mother's legacy, her family's burden and vindication. "Is that it?" Samuel asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Elizabeth's journal." Abigail nodded carefully, unwrapping the oilskin to reveal a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age, but intact. Mother's record of Maple Creek, and everything that came after. Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he reached out to touch the journal, his fingers tracing the faded leather with reverence. "She wrote in this every night," he said softly. "Said the truth needed a witness, even if that witness was just paper and ink." Morgan cleared his throat. "That journal is evidence now. We'll need it for the official record." "You'll have it," Samuel assured him. "But first, my family deserves to read it in private. To remember Elizabeth as she would have wanted." The sheriff nodded his understanding. "Fair enough. Let's get you back to the house, tend to those injuries. The doctor should be arriving with the rest of my men soon." As they made their way back toward the ranch buildings, Solomon found himself walking beside Abigail. She carried the journal carefully, as though it might crumble to dust if handled too roughly. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, noting the complex emotions playing across her face. She considered the question for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I thought killing Hargrove would feel like justice, or at least closure." She glanced down at the journal. "But it just feels hollow, empty." Solomon understood all too well. Vengeance usually does. "Is that why you didn't pull the trigger?" she asked. "When you had the chance in the study?" The question caught him off guard. He'd had Hargrove in his sights, could have ended him then and there. Why had he hesitated? "I wanted answers more than I wanted him dead," Solomon realized aloud. "And perhaps part of me remembered the man he once was, or thought he was." Abigail nodded slowly. "Mother wrote about forgiveness in her later journals, said it wasn't about excusing what was done, but refusing to let it poison your future." She looked up at Solomon, her green eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I'm not sure I'm there yet." "Few of us are," Solomon acknowledged, "but recognizing that is a beginning." The main house was now secured, Hargrove's surviving men disarmed and under guard. Morgan's deputies had established a perimeter, while the local doctor, an elderly man with gentle hands and sharp eyes, tended to Samuel's injuries in the study that had so recently been the scene of confrontation. Solomon stood on the porch watching as more riders approached from the south, additional reinforcements from San Angelo, arriving too late for the conflict, but in time to help secure prisoners and evidence. The pocket watch weighed heavy in his pocket. He withdrew it, studying its golden surface in the lamplight spilling from the house. Emma's gift stopped on the day she and Lily died. A memorial to time, frozen to a life suspended in grief. Behind him, the door opened. Abigail stepped out, her face showing the strain of the night's events, but also a new serenity. "Father's asking for you," she said. "The doctor says he'll recover, though it may take time." Solomon nodded, still looking at the watch in his palm. "Is that her?" Abigail asked gently. "Your wife, Emma," Solomon confirmed, opening the case to reveal the delicate engraving inside. "She gave me this before I left for war. Said as long as it kept time, I'd find my way home to her." Abigail moved closer, her shoulder brushing his as she leaned to see the inscription. "And it stopped when the flood took them." "Yes." Solomon's thumb traced the familiar words. I never wound it again. Felt like betraying their memory somehow, moving on when they couldn't. For a long moment, they stood in silence, sharing the weight of loss that connected them. Across the years, Solomon's family, Abigail's mother, the victims of Maple Creek, whose names were recorded in Elizabeth Hayes's journal. My mother believed time was a circle, not a line, Abigail said finally. The Cherokees say we don't move away from our past. We carry it with us always, returning to where we began, but with new understanding. Solomon considered her words, feeling their truth resonate within him. For 10 years he'd tried to outrun his past, to stand still while the world moved on without him. But the past had found him anyway, dragging him back into its currents. Perhaps it was time to stop fighting, to let the stream flow. His fingers found the winding mechanism stiff from disuse. Slowly, deliberately, he turned it, feeling the gentle resistance of gears long dormant coming back to life. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was so faint it might have been his imagination. But the second hand moved hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, marking the passage of time once more. Solomon. Abigail's voice was soft with understanding. He closed the watch case, returning it to his pocket. But this time the weight felt different, not a burden of grief, but a connection to what had been and what might yet be. Your father's waiting, he said simply. Inside they found Samuel Hayes resting on a sofa the doctor had insisted he use instead of returning to his desk. His injuries had been cleaned and bandaged, his broken ribs bound. Despite the ordeal, his eyes were clear and alert as Solomon entered. Reed, he greeted, extending his hand. I owe you my daughter's life, and my own. Solomon clasped the offered hand. No debt between us, Hayes. Your wife was at Maple Creek because of men like me who didn't stand up when we should have. Samuel shook his head. Elizabeth never blamed the soldiers, only the ones giving orders. His gaze grew distant. She was the strongest person I ever knew, survived hell itself, yet never lost her capacity for joy, for love. She sounds remarkable, Solomon said sincerely. She was. Samuel gestured to a chair beside the sofa. Sit, please. There's something I need to ask you. Solomon complied, noting that Abigail had moved to stand by the window, giving them a measure of privacy while remaining present. Hargrove's last words, Samuel began, about following orders from higher up. Did he elaborate? No, Solomon admitted. He died before he could explain. Samuel's expression grew troubled. Elizabeth suspected as much, that Maple Creek wasn't just a colonel's error in judgment, but something more calculated. The journal might contain more details, Solomon suggested. Perhaps, Samuel glanced toward his daughter. Abigail will need to go through it carefully. Elizabeth wrote in Cherokee for the most sensitive parts a precaution in case it fell into the wrong hands. Solomon's estimation of Elizabeth Hayes's foresight increased further. Smart woman. The smartest. A sad smile touched Samuel's battered face. I miss her every day, even after all these years. The simple statement hit Solomon with unexpected force. I miss her every day. How many times had he thought those exact words about Emma? Yet Samuel Hayes had found a way to honor his wife's memory, while continuing to live to raise her daughter, to fight for justice in her name. Mr. Reed, Samuel continued, his tone shifting to something more formal. I have another favor to ask, a significant one. Name it. The journal isn't safe here, not anymore. Hargrove may be dead, but if he was telling the truth about powerful men behind him, he let the implication hang in the air. It needs to reach the federal authorities in Washington. people who can act on its contents without fear of local interference. Solomon understood immediately what was being asked. "You want me to deliver it?" Samuel nodded. "Abigail will accompany you. She can translate the Cherokee passages, provide context where needed." He held Solomon's gaze steadily. "I'm asking a great deal, I know. The journey is long and the risk substantial, but there are few men I would trust with my daughter's safety and my wife's legacy." Solomon glanced at Abigail, who had turned from the window at the mention of her name. Her expression was unreadable in the lamplight, but her posture conveyed readiness, determination. "And you, Miss Hayes," Solomon asked, "are you willing to undertake such a journey?" "More than willing," she replied without hesitation. "My mother's truth deserves to be heard, and the men behind Maple Creek deserve to face justice no matter how powerful they may be." Solomon considered the request. Taking the journal to Washington would mean weeks of travel potential danger from those who might want the truth suppressed, and delaying his return to the solitude of Justice Creek. Yet, he found the prospect didn't disturb him, as it might have days earlier. The watch ticked softly in his pocket, marking seconds that no longer felt like an indictment. "I'll do it," he said finally. "But first, there's something I need to attend to at my ranch. A day's ride at most, then we can begin the journey east." Samuel's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Reed. This means more than I can express." "One condition," Solomon added. "You come with us, once you're well enough to travel." Surprise registered on Samuel's face. "The ranch can be managed by your foreman until you return," Solomon countered. "The journal is your wife's legacy, but it's also your life's work. You deserve to see it through to the end." After a moment's consideration, Samuel nodded. "Agreed, though the doctor says it will be at least a week before I'm fit to travel any distance." "Then we'll wait," Abigail decided, moving to join them. "Father needs time to heal, and she glanced at Solomon. "I'd like to see Justice Creek, if that's acceptable." The request surprised him, but not unpleasantly. "There's not much to see. Just a small ranch, a creek, nothing special." "I think there's more there than you admit," she replied softly, "even to yourself." Before Solomon could respond, Sheriff Morgan entered the study, his expression somber but satisfied. "Prisoners are secured," he reported. "We'll transport them to San Angelo in the morning. Doctor says those who need immediate medical attention are stable enough to travel." "And Hargrove," Samuel asked, "being prepared for transport as well?" Morgan removed his hat, running a hand through his silver hair. "The telegraph office in town will be open by now. I'll send word to the federal marshal in Austin, let them know what's happened here." "Thank you, Walter," Samuel said sincerely. "For everything." The sheriff replaced his hat, nodding acknowledgement. "Justice was a long time coming in this case, but it arrived eventually." His gaze shifted to Solomon. "Always does, one way or another." As Morgan left to organize the night watch, Solomon found himself reflecting on the sheriff's words. Justice, like the creek that gave his land its name, found its path, regardless of obstacles. Sometimes that path took unexpected turns, ran underground for a time, but eventually reached its destination. The night deepened around the Crescent Moon Ranch. Deputies kept vigilant watch, while those inside sought what rest they could after the events of the day. Solomon declined the offer of a guest room, preferring to keep watch from the porch, his rifle across his knees. The stars wheeled overhead, countless and brilliant in the clear Texas sky. He remembered nights like this during the war, when the beauty of the heavens had seemed an obscene contrast to the horrors men inflicted upon one another below. The door opened softly behind him. Abigail emerged, wrapped in a shawl against the mild night chill. Without a word, she settled into the chair beside his. "You should be resting," Solomon observed, though he made no move to send her back inside. "I've tried," as she drew the shawl closer around her shoulders. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Hargrove falling, feel the weight of the gun in my hand." Solomon nodded, understanding all too well. "First time is the hardest." "Does it get easier?" she asked, then shook her head. "No, don't answer that. I don't think I want it to be easier." "Wise," Solomon acknowledged. "Taking a life should never become comfortable even when necessary." They sat in silence for a time, the only sounds the soft creaking of the porch boards and the distant calls of night creatures going about their business. "I've been thinking about what happens after Washington," Abigail said finally. "After the journal is delivered, the evidence presented." "That's looking quite a ways ahead." "Perhaps, but planning for the future seems important suddenly." She turned to look at him, her profile silvered by moonlight. "What will you do?" "Return to Justice Creek." The question gave Solomon pause. A week ago, the answer would have been simple, unequivocal. Of course, he would return to his solitude, his carefully constructed existence that required nothing from him but survival. Now, he wasn't so certain. "I don't know," he admitted. "For 10 years, Justice Creek has been not home exactly, but shelter, a place to hide from the world." And now, Solomon's hand moved to his pocket, feeling the gentle vibration of the watch as it marked each passing second. "Now, I'm not sure hiding is what I'm meant to do anymore." Abigail nodded as though his answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. "When I was captive in that stable," she said softly, "I prayed for rescue, not expecting it, just hoping. Then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I'd almost given up on." She looked down at her hands, still bearing the faint marks of her ordeal. "I don't believe things happen without reason, Solomon. Our paths crossing. When they did, Hargrove, returning after all these years. The journal finally reaching those who can act on its contents. It feels like streams joining to form a river, something larger than any one of us." The poetry of her metaphor struck Solomon deeply. Streams joining to form a river. Individual lives, separate journeys converging into something powerful enough to carve new paths through even the hardest stone. "Your mother's influence shows in you," he said. "That way of seeing connections where others might see only coincidence." A small smile touched Abigail's lips. She would have liked you, seen past your gruff exterior to the heart beneath. "Not much to see there," Solomon demurred. "Just an old soldier trying to outrun his ghosts." "I think there's more," Abigail insisted gently. "Much more. A man who risked everything to save a stranger, who faced his worst memories to help deliver justice, who wound his watch again after 10 years of standing still." Her perception unsettled and moved him simultaneously. This young woman who had endured kidnapping, witnessed violence, taken a life in defense of others, still maintained a clear-eyed compassion that saw through the barriers he'd built around himself. "You give me too much credit," he said finally. "And you give yourself too little." Abigail rose from her chair, the shawl falling around her shoulders like wings. "Good night, Solomon. Try to rest. Tomorrow begins a new journey for both of us." She disappeared inside, leaving Solomon alone with the night, and her words echoing in his mind. Tomorrow begins a new journey. The prospect should have filled him with dread, with resistance. Instead, he felt something he'd nearly forgotten: anticipation. The watch ticked steadily in his pocket, no longer an accusation, but a promise. Time moving forward again, carrying him with it, whether he willed it or not. Perhaps it was time to stop fighting the current. The journey to Justice Creek took most of the following day. Solomon and Abigail rode at an easy pace, mindful of the events of the previous days and the longer journey that still lay ahead of them. They left behind a recovering Samuel Hayes under Sheriff Morgan's protection, with plans to return in a week's time to begin their expedition to Washington. As they crested the final rise overlooking Solomon's modest ranch, the setting sun bathed the buildings in golden light. The creek that gave the property its name glinted like polished silver, winding its way through pastures still green despite the summer heat. "It's beautiful," Abigail said, reining her horse to a halt beside Solomon's. "Peaceful." Solomon saw his home through her eyes, the small but sturdy cabin, the well-maintained barn, the careful arrangement of corrals and outbuildings that bespoke pride in craftsmanship, if not wealth. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of pride in what he'd built here. "It serves its purpose," he allowed, urging his horse forward down the gentle slope. Sergeant greeted them with an indignant whinny from the corral, clearly expressing his displeasure at being left behind during recent adventures. Solomon dismounted and approached the aging gelding, rubbing the white blaze between his eyes. "Missed you too, old friend," he murmured. "Got someone for you to meet." Abigail had dismounted as well, approaching with the respect due to an elder statesman among horses. "Hello, Sergeant," she said softly, offering her palm for inspection. The horse sniffed her hand thoroughly, then nudged her shoulder with unexpected gentleness. Abigail laughed, a sound so unexpected and musical that Solomon found himself smiling in response. "He approves," he noted, surprising himself with the lightness in his tone. "High praise indeed," Abigail replied, stroking Sergeant's neck. "Father always said you can judge a man by how his animals greet him." They settled the new horses in the barn, then made their way to the cabin. Solomon was acutely aware of his modest living conditions as he opened the door for Abigail. The interior was clean but sparse. The stone fireplace, the narrow bed with Emma's quilt, the rough-hewn table and chairs. Few personal touches softened the space, reflecting the utilitarian existence he'd chosen. But Abigail showed no dismay at the simplicity. Instead, she moved through the small cabin with appreciation, running her fingers along the mantel, examining the few books on the shelf beside the fireplace, studying the craftsmanship of the furniture. "You built all this yourself?" she asked. Solomon nodded, oddly pleased by her interest. "After the flood. Needed something to keep my hands busy." "You have a gift," she said sincerely. "There's care in every detail." While Solomon prepared a simple meal, Abigail explored the property, returning with a handful of herbs she'd found growing near the creek. "Wild mint and rosemary," she explained, adding them to the stew he'd started. "Mother always said good food feeds the spirit as well as the body." They ate at the small table, the lengthening shadows of evening softening the cabin's austere interior. Conversation flowed more easily than Solomon would have expected, ranging from the practical details of their upcoming journey to more personal reflections. "Tell me about Emma," Abigail said as they finished their meal. "And Lily, if you don't mind." The request might once have sent Solomon retreating into pained silence. But tonight, with the watch ticking in his pocket and Abigail's compassionate gaze across the table, he found he wanted to speak of them. "Emma was fearless." He began, the words coming slowly at first, then with greater ease. "City-bred from Chicago. Everyone said she'd wither out here on the frontier. But she thrived. Built a garden that was the envy of the county. Learned to shoot better than most men. Faced down a mountain lion once that was after our chickens." A smile touched his lips at the memory. 5 months pregnant with Lily at the time. Didn't even wake me. Just took the shotgun and handled it herself. "She sounds remarkable," Abigail said. She was. Solomon's expression softened further. And Lily, she had her mother's spirit, fearless, curious about everything, 7 years old when he paused, the familiar pain present, but somehow less overwhelming than usual. When we lost her, already writing stories about the animals on the ranch, wanted to be a teacher someday. Abigail reached across the table, her hand coming to rest lightly on his. They would be proud of the man you are, Solomon. The simple statement caught him off guard. Proud of what a man who had retreated from life, who had let grief calcify into a shell around him. But looking into Abigail's eyes, he saw no judgment, only a clear-eyed assessment that somehow pierced through his self-recrimination to something he'd nearly forgotten before he was a grieving widower, before he was a soldier haunted by his failures. He had been a peer worthy of Emma's love, of Lily's adoration. Perhaps some essence of that man remained buried beneath the sediment of years. "Thank you," he said, simply, the words inadequate but sincere. After the meal, they sat on the porch, watching darkness settle over the land. Stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, brilliant against the deepening blue-black. The creek murmured in the distance, a soothing counterpoint to the chorus of cicadas and nightbirds. "I see why you chose this place," Abigail said, her voice hushed, as though reluctant to disturb the tranquility. "There's healing in this land." Solomon considered her observation. Had he come here seeking healing or merely escape? Perhaps both, though he'd only acknowledged the latter. "It served its purpose," he said again, but this time the words carried a different weight, recognition that perhaps Justice Creek's purpose in his life was changing, evolving into something new. The watch ticked in his pocket, steady and reassuring. Time moving forward. Life continuing, whether he willed it or not. "What happens after Washington?" he asked, echoing Abigail's question from the previous night. She seemed surprised that he would raise the subject. "I'm not entirely certain," she admitted. "Help Father rebuild the Crescent Moon, I suppose. Continue his work with the Cherokee communities along the border." "Good work," Solomon acknowledged. "Worthwhile. And you," Abigail turned the question back to him, "will you return here?" Solomon gazed out at his land, seeing it not as the fortress of solitude it had been, but as it might be, a place of productivity, of connection, perhaps even of joy again someday. "I think so," he said slowly, "but not to hide any more. To build something more." The word hung between them, laden with possibilities neither was quite ready to articulate. More than solitude, more than mere existence. Perhaps in time, more than friendship. The night deepened around Justice Creek Ranch. Inside the cabin, Solomon insisted Abigail take the bed while he made a comfortable enough pallet near the fireplace. Sleep came more easily than he'd expected, untroubled by the nightmares that had plagued him for a decade. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee brewing. Solomon opened his eyes to find Abigail already up, moving about the kitchen with quiet efficiency. "Hope you don't mind," she said, echoing her words from their first morning together. "Thought it was the least I could do." This time Solomon didn't admonish her to rest. Instead, he accepted the offered cup with genuine gratitude, recognizing the small domestic gesture for what it was, not an obligation, but a choice, a gift freely given. They spent the day preparing for the longer journey ahead. Solomon repaired tack-oiled weapons and took stock of supplies they would need. Abigail helped where she could, but also took time to explore the property more thoroughly, returning from one such expedition with a handful of wildflowers that she placed in an old jar on the table. The simple touch of beauty in his utilitarian home affected Solomon more deeply than he would have expected. Like the winding of the watch, it marked a shift subtle but significant in how he viewed his surroundings. Not just as shelter, but as a home that might yet nurture life rather than merely contain it. As evening approached on their second day at Justice Creek, Solomon made a decision. After supper, he led Abigail to a small rise beyond the barn, where a pair of simple wooden crosses stood silhouetted against the sunset sky. Emma and Lily, he explained quietly. Not their bodies, those were never recovered, but their spirits, a place to remember. Abigail stood beside him in respectful silence, understanding the significance of his bringing her to this private memorial. I used to come here every day, Solomon continued, talk to them, tell them about the ranch, the weather, anything that came to mind. Gradually it became once a week, then once a month. Eventually, he shook his head. I stopped coming altogether. Felt like I was betraying them somehow by continuing to live when they couldn't. And now, Abigail asked gently. Solomon withdrew the pocket watch, its golden surface catching the last rays of the setting sun. Now I think perhaps the betrayal was in stopping, in letting grief turn to stagnation. He knelt between the crosses, placing a hand on each weathered wood surface. I'm sorry, he said softly, not for living, but for forgetting how to live. You both deserved better than that. Abigail remained a respectful distance away, giving him privacy for this moment of reconciliation. When Solomon finally rose and rejoined her, something had shifted in his bearing, a weight lifted, if not removed entirely. Thank you, he said simply, for being here. Thank you for sharing them with me, she replied, her green eyes reflecting genuine emotion. They walked back to the cabin together as the first stars appeared overhead. The creek murmured its endless song, water flowing over stone, finding its path, regardless of obstacles. Justice, like the water, would find its way sometimes underground, sometimes diverted, but always moving forward. Tomorrow, they would begin the journey back to the Crescent Moon Ranch, and from there eastward to Washington with Elizabeth Hayes's journal. The road ahead would not be easy. Those who had ordered the massacre at Maple Creek, who had used Victor Hargrove as their instrument, would not welcome exposure of their crimes. But tonight, under the vast Texas sky, Solomon Reed felt something he had nearly forgotten: purpose. Not merely survival, not the empty routine that had structured his days for a decade, but true purpose, a reason to move forward rather than stand still. The watch ticked steadily in his pocket as they walked side by side toward the warm light of the cabin, time flowing like the creek carrying them forward into whatever lay ahead. For the first time in 10 years, Solomon found himself looking toward tomorrow with something akin to hope. Epilogue. 6 months later. The winter wind cut sharp across the capital city, sending fallen leaves skittering along Pennsylvania Avenue. Solomon Reed pulled his coat tighter, his breath fogging in the December air as he climbed the steps of the Treasury Building. Washington was a far cry from the Texas plains, its marble edifices and crowded streets, a stark contrast to the open spaces and big skies of home. 3 months they had been here now, presenting evidence, giving testimony, navigating the labyrinthine processes of government bureaucracy. Elizabeth Hayes's journal had proven even more significant than they had anticipated. Its meticulous documentation of Maple Creek, combined with her later investigations, had implicated not just military officers, but cabinet-level officials in what amounted to war crimes. Men who had prolonged the conflict for personal profit, who had ordered civilian targets destroyed to create terror and resistance that justified continued military expenditures. The revelations had sent shockwaves through Washington society. Several prominent men had already resigned in disgrace. Others faced criminal charges. The full extent of the conspiracy was still being uncovered, with new evidence emerging weekly. Inside the imposing building, Solomon made his way to a now familiar office on the third floor. Samuel Hayes was already there, deep in conversation with the federal prosecutor who had become their ally in the pursuit of justice. Though still bearing scars from his ordeal, Samuel had recovered his strength during their journey east, his determination to see his wife's work completed, driving him through the challenges of their mission. "Reed?" he greeted, rising to shake Solomon's hand. "Right on time. We were just discussing the Wilson testimony." The prosecutor, a serious young man named Thornton, nodded in acknowledgement. "Mr. Reed, your additional statement has been most helpful in corroborating the journal's accounts." Solomon took a seat, noting the thick file of documents spread across the desk, the accumulated evidence of crimes long hidden, now exposed to the light of justice. "Any word on the Fredericks indictment? Grand jury convenes tomorrow," Thornton confirmed. "With the evidence we've assembled, I'm confident of an indictment. The trial will be more challenging, of course, but—" He shrugged, his expression determined. "The truth has a weight of its own." The meeting continued for another hour, reviewing strategies and scheduling further testimony. When it concluded, Solomon and Samuel emerged into the winter sunlight, both somber but satisfied with the progress being made. "Abigail was planning to visit the Smithsonian today," Samuel mentioned as they descended the broad steps. "Said something about Cherokee artifacts in their collection she wanted to examine." Solomon nodded, unsurprised. During their months in Washington, Abigail had embraced the city's cultural offerings with characteristic enthusiasm, particularly those related to her mother's heritage. Her insights had proven invaluable, not only in translating Elizabeth's journal, but in providing context that helped the prosecutors understand the full significance of what had occurred at Maple Creek and after. "I told her I'd meet her there when we finished," Solomon replied. "Care to join us?" Samuel shook his head, a knowing gleam in his eye. "Think I'll let you young folks enjoy the afternoon, without an old man slowing you down." Solomon might have protested the characterization. He was hardly young at 51, but he understood the subtle gift Samuel was offering. Time alone with Abigail had become increasingly precious as their work in Washington intensified. The Smithsonian loomed ahead, its red sandstone facade distinctive against the winter sky. Inside, Solomon found Abigail exactly where he'd expected in the Native American exhibition, studying a display of traditional Cherokee crafts with intense concentration. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting with a smile that still caught him off guard with its warmth. The past months had changed her too. The physical marks of her ordeal had long since faded, but a new confidence had emerged in their place, a certainty of purpose that reminded Solomon of her mother, as Samuel had described her. "How was the meeting?" she asked as he joined her. "Productive. Thornton believes the grand jury will indict Fredericks tomorrow." Solomon glanced at the display that had captured her attention, a series of intricately woven baskets, their patterns similar to those Elizabeth Hayes had incorporated into her embroidery. "Find what you were looking for?" Abigail nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Mother learned these patterns from her grandmother. Said they told stories if you knew how to read them." Her fingers hovered near the glass, tracing the design without touching it. "This one speaks of rivers joining, becoming stronger together than they were apart." The metaphor struck Solomon as particularly apt. Their separate journeys, individual streams of experience and purpose, had converged into something more powerful than any could have achieved alone. They left the museum as afternoon shadows lengthened across the mall. The air had grown colder, promising snow before morning. Abigail tucked her hand into the crook of Solomon's arm as they walked, a gesture that had become natural over the months of their acquaintance. "Father received a letter from the Crescent Moon yesterday," she mentioned. The winter wheat is planted, the cattle are thriving. Jenkins is managing things well in our absence. Solomon nodded, pleased, but unsurprised. Samuel had chosen his foreman carefully, ensuring the ranch would continue to prosper during their extended stay in Washington. "And Justice Creek?" Abigail asked, glancing up at him. "Any word from Morgan about your place?" "All is well," Solomon confirmed. "Sargent is enjoying his retirement, apparently. Morgan says the old horse spends his days sunning himself in the south pasture, looking like a gentleman of leisure." Abigail laughed, the sound bright in the winter air. "He's earned it, as have you." They walked in companionable silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts. The work in Washington was nearing its conclusion. Soon, decisions would need to be made about what came next. "I've been thinking," Solomon said finally, as they paused on a bridge overlooking the partially frozen Potomac, "about after, when we return to Texas." Abigail turned to face him, her expression open, expectant. "And—" Solomon withdrew the pocket watch from his coat, its golden surface gleaming even in the fading light. For 6 months, it had kept perfect time, marking seconds that no longer felt like an indictment, but a gift. "Time doesn't stand still," he said, his voice low but steady. "No matter how much we might wish it would sometimes. It flows like the creek, finding its path." He met her gaze directly. "I've been standing still for 10 years, Abigail. I don't want to stand still anymore." Understanding dawned in her eyes, not surprise, but recognition of something long developing between them. "What are you saying, Solomon?" "I'm saying Justice Creek has been a shelter, a place to hide. But perhaps it could be more." His hand closed around the watch, feeling its steady tick against his palm. "Perhaps it could be a home again, a real home." "For you," Abigail said softly. "For us," Solomon corrected gently. "If you wanted that." The moment stretched between them waited with possibility. Snow began to fall, delicate flakes drifting down to settle on Abigail's dark hair like stars against the night sky. "Is this a proposal, Solomon Reed?" she asked, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed deeper emotion. "An inelegant one, perhaps," he admitted. "But yes, I'm asking if, when our work here is done, you might consider joining your stream to mine, making Justice Creek your home, as well as mine." Abigail studied him for a long moment, snowflakes gathering on her eyelashes. Then she smiled, a radiant expression that seemed to warm the winter air around them. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that very much." Solomon released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. With careful deliberation, he placed the watch in Abigail's palm, closing her fingers around it. "Emma gave me this to remind me that time would bring us back together," he said quietly. And in a way, it did. Not as I expected, but perhaps as it was meant to be. Abigail looked down at the watch, then back at Solomon, understanding the significance of the gesture. "I'll treasure it," she promised, "and the love it represents, both past and present." As snowflakes continued to fall around them, Solomon Reed drew Abigail Hayes into a gentle embrace. Behind them, the Potomac flowed steadily beneath its layer of ice, unstoppable despite the winter's grip. Ahead lay justice for Maple Creek, a return to Texas, and a future neither could have imagined months before. The pocket watch ticked between them, marking moments that would never come again, but led inexorably toward what waited downstream. Like justice, like grief, like healing, the stream flowed on, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but always moving forward, carving its path through even the hardest stone. And Solomon Reed, who had once tried to stand apart from that flow, found himself at last willing to be carried by its current not away from the past, but toward a future where memory and hope might flow together, in the same riverbed, stronger for their joining.